Welcome everyone to this event. My name's Jo Trousdale. I'm one of the 3 SIG conveners that is hosting today's event. There's a big team behind the scenes, not just myself, Kerry and Victoria that you can see, but also a team at BERA. And also we're working with Sarah Campbell, a colleague at Exeter University, who's going to be helping us in assimilating the kinds of responses that hopefully you'll share with us during today's event. There is also a team of other experts who worked with us about a month ago at a workshop exploring dimensions of creativity, and hopefully as part of your introduction to today's event you have looked at the provocation event that came from the work that we did with them. And the link to that should be in the notifications at the top of the chat bar on your right hand side if you haven't seen it. So you should have been sent a link to the provocation document. Please do have a little look at that. We'll be using that as a reference point during today's session, and asking you really to interact with us in several ways, but mainly around using the mural as a means to comment. And you can see that as a little screenshot of it. It may look different at the moment. Hopefully it will get more and more populated as the session progresses, as you add your comments in. And so that's an opportunity for you to respond to the 3 key questions that we're working with, which is, where are we now, where are we going, and what can we do better in terms of working in terms of educational creativity, in terms of evaluation, research and practice. So that's the ongoing tool. You can use that at any time you like during the presentation. But also, if there are questions you want to raise to us as a group, or particularly in relation to a presentation, please use the chat on the right-hand side to do that. And the 4 of us, myself, Kerry, Victoria and Sarah, will be looking at your questions. And as the presentation suggested, we'll be looking at those particularly that you're interested in. So if somebody poses a question that you're interested in, you can upvote it, you can signal to us it's something of interest, and we can then take that to the participants. So those are the kind of 2 main ways of engaging with us. Obviously, there'll be the polls as well that each of the presenters will be using. But please do engage via the chat to let us know what kind of things you want us to probe, what you want to know more about in relation to the speakers, and also the mural in terms of having a chat with us as well. So just to say in relation to using the mural, it is a public document, whereas this is kind of closed to us as participants. The mural is not, it's a public document, so please make sure that you don't put any personal data into that. That's something we need to kind of take care of. And Victoria also will be keeping track particularly of the tweets that you want to pose in relation to today's events. So hopefully between us, we will be able to feed in the different kind of comments you're making across mural, and in terms of chat, and in terms of tweeting. So just to have a little look then at the plan for today. Hopefully you've also received this in your pre-registration information, but this is the plan for today. So after this introduction, we're going into our first presentation today, a kind of research practice dialogue between 2 different kinds of experts in the field. Sarah Bracken, who's a head teacher at a primary school in Coventry, and Teresa Kremin, who is a professor at the Open University and engaged more broadly in terms of research. And so the interaction between the 2 of them is intended as a provocation of different dimensions that they've picked out from the provocation document to also propose that provocation to you. So your questions back to that will then form the last part of that section. So please do post your questions in that time between 1:15 and 1:45. We'll take those. Kerry will be sending those back to and posing those to Teresa and Sarah in response. We're followed after that by then Professor Bill Lucas, who'll be giving us more of a kind of national, international perspective in relation to these prompts. And likewise, questions you've got for Bill, post those in the chat, and Victoria will take those forward. Then we're going to have a plenary section, and we will revisit those 3 questions that we're looking at on the mural before a break. During the break time, the team of us will still be around. So if there's questions you still want to pose, things you want to engage with in terms of the mural, please carry on. This isn't necessarily a close to it, but there is a change in terms of the last section today. In that the last section of the day features a characteristic that's very common to our Creativity SIGs, which is the Anna Craft Memorial Lecture, which we are delighted to be able to have Howard Gardner present today. And the event concludes at 4:30. And again, for the Q&A in that last section of the day, please pose your questions and post those up. Okay, I think that's everything from me, and I think we can move on.
So, welcome colleagues to what is an opportunity for Sarah and I really to dialogue, to chat, to converse. We haven't created a presentation with argument points, as it were. We've created a series of visuals which come from Sarah's school to provoke us into thinking some of the spaces and corners around research and practice in relation to creativity. We're hoping to develop this as a conversation, a really genuinely a live conversation. We've obviously had conversations before to plan it, but we haven't kind of sealed it. You'll make this point, then I'll make that point. What we're trying to do is illuminate or open a space in which we can illuminate some of the challenges for research and the challenges for practice, and as Joe said, offer some kind of provocation for you to take part in the conversation too. So we're really just coming from our own perspectives of being a head teacher and being, in my case, a researcher, professor, whose main focus has always been in literacy and creativity, and so looking at both of those. So I think I've now got the capacity to move on, have I? Met, could you move it on or give me the option of moving on? Doesn't seem to want to move. Thank you. Can you move it on? I can't seem to move the screen on. Thank you very much. Hope there'll be an arrow. I can do that later on. Click once. I was clicking several times, but anyway, not to worry. Well, we thought we could barely consider creativity in education without attending to the current context. Where are we now? Not yet out of a pandemic, and clearly schools have been experiencing, as this young person did, the stop-start, the never fully closed, the never fully open journey, the bubbles, being sent home regularly and so on, the uncertainty, the challenge, the difference that this visual representation made by this Year 6 child from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation work, when we're thinking about learning from the COVID context, where are we currently? And one of the things we both felt, which was important, was how creative the profession had been, how flexible and creative the profession, not only in terms of pivoting in response to the challenges of suddenly the children being sent home and whole libraries being emptied. Remember a colleague from Great Yarmouth, Moorlands Primary School, and he said, I think there are 6 books left. We said, just take as many as you need or want, knowing that these young people were unlikely to return for a very long time. And I believe they got a great deal back, although obviously not all. But we also thought it's not just about pivoting in relation to different kind of teaching and learning. It's hugely, and as we both understood, and Sarah can give us some evidence of, teachers developing professional agency in that space. There was a new, unrecognized, unknown space to go and inhabit, and teachers asserted their own space to find and make choices for themselves to be independent as professionals, as well as collaborating with others. And we thought it was a striking, one of the striking lessons for us as researchers and as educators was the remarkable professional agency shown in that time. And The chat line tells me I need to click it. If that doesn't work, you can use the small left arrows which appear on the bottom left. If only they did. They are white, but I can't see any arrows whatsoever. Could you just move us on, Met, please? Thank you. I'm going to have to ask you. There's nothing visually showing me at all. This is another bubble life, as this young man shows what it might be like, how confused potentially he felt, how he tried to express his sense of the unknowing. And what we also felt strongly was that actually it isn't just the teachers who were professionally agentic in that context, but the young people who found their own way to communicate on pavements, to support the NHS by finding chalks and by drawing in windows, by placing teddy bears there, etc., to denote their communicative competence, their creative response to a challenging situation they were finding themselves in. So I'm going to turn to Sarah to ask her to just offer us some thoughts about independent learning in terms of the teachers and indeed of the children.
Okay, thank you. I think curriculum practice has really shifted and children have had more of an opportunity for independent learning. They've been working on their own at home without anybody to support them apart from their families. There's been a rapid growth in ICT skills. Teachers have had to reflect on their teaching and think about, how do we present our work so that all children can understand it and all children can participate in it? And then again, how do children present their findings? How are they going to record what they've learned? And this isn't just about taking a photograph, because we have to understand that learning behind it. So how do children explain the learning that they have gone through when they're at home? And it's about children looking at those key questions. What key questions do I need to answer? How do I answer those key questions? It's about looking at class debates. Have we been able to use these new IT skills to go into safe chat rooms where they can chat with each other and debate the things that they are learning about? For example, the very early years have been looking at practical tasks, how teachers can set up these practical tasks for children to do at home. What resources will they need? What resources will people have at home that they can use to support their learning? It's about how we can get that engagement there. And then that reflection on the learning. What have they learned? How do we take these children forward? How do we know where they are and where to take them next while they're at home? And I think with the older children, it's been about offering more flexibility and including a combination of subjects so that they're actually being responsible for their learning, linking things together. So the children decide how they present their work, how they explain what they've done, as well as learning those key skills that have to go along. Actually, how can children be creative and actually present their work in a way that's meaningful to them?
Thank you. I still can't move on. Could you please move us on? Okay. So Sarah, were you talking to that one really in that sense?
Yeah, that's about looking at those ICT skills that everybody has had to develop and how we can transfer what we do in the classroom for children to be able to have a valuable experience at home. And then if we look at the next slide, it's about trying to push active exploratory thinking. It's about looking at giving children an experience that they can remember and that's related to their learning. We have teachers working alongside children, and where children in the past have been able to go on to trips, we haven't been able to do that. So let's immerse them in a situation. Let's have role play. Let's have people as those characters. And looking at their philosophy, do children know the point of their learning? Are children going to engage at learning at home if they don't know the point of why they're doing it? And about keeping learning relevant for them and about it being inquisitive to motivate them. It's not just a way that they pass the time of day. It's actually they are finding it as a valuable experience that they're learning something from. We've had to work on children's social skills. How can children develop those social skills when they're on their own at home and might not have any contact with another child apart from through their online learning within school? And it's about developing that use of space. How do we use space within school and outside school and at home to enhance that learning? And also looking at which gaps children have needed to fill. which gaps are relevant, which gaps can be linked together. So children's learning is linked to with things need to be taught in isolation, or can we teach them as the children move on?
Okay, sorry, Sarah, it seems to be working off the keyboard and not off the mouse. I'm going to take us back. Okay, I just wanted to kind of push back on a bit of that, really, because it sounds like you have, in your context, been able to capitalize on that. But certainly Gemma Moss's work from the Institute of Education showed that many schools were caught up in this duty of care or duty to teach, and that those children who were in high SES context or low SES context and highly challenged context ended up having to spend a lot of the early COVID months, as it were, of lockdown, responding to the welfare and indeed providing for food, as it were, of families. And it seems as if the profession has learnt during this period about the increased professional awareness of how deeply poverty impacts on the young people. And so that for many of the schools involved in her study, at least, they had to prioritise their duty of care over the duty to teach, because there wasn't space to cope with and enable the children to access any kind of curriculum. Do you feel that's kind of been an issue for you at school, or not really?
I feel that at the beginning it was definitely an issue, and then it was looking at people's roles. How could we link the two things together? How could we use children's home life to enhance their learning? So children who didn't have anything at home, what could we do to support them? What could we provide them with? But actually, what does everybody have at home that could support them with their learning? What different resources could children use to do that? So children had also the responsibility of saying how they wanted to learn something. So it might be that we, for example, might have been learning about the rainforests, and it was up to children how they presented their findings. So it might be that some children made a beautiful model or, made a presentation. Others just spoke to their teacher over the phone. And that was just as relevant. It was about learning for the needs of those children and how we adapted those learning to meet those needs. I think the welfare of children was our priority and always should be our priority. But it's about how could we link and how could we work with both that learning and that welfare.
I mean, it was interesting to find that the Chartered College, I think it was February of this year, Alison Peacock pushed back at the minister saying, we've got so much on-screen learning. We need to be encouraging more off-screen learning. And then the Chartered College created a series of compact guides to support children's independent learning at home off-screen. And I think that was in part because it was clear that there were many children already engaged in that because teachers had set them those kinds of activities, but also that some schools were requiring children to be in the kind of online all day or large parts of it. And that was problematic in itself, not only because of access to equipment, but okay, I'm going to move us on, but I think it was really important to contextualize this dialogue around research and practice and creativity from the COVID context. The challenges have clearly been huge for teachers and for others. And as the late Ken Robinson argued back in 2005, as challenges that students face become more complex, it's essential schools help them to develop their unique capabilities for creative thought and action. And certainly when they're challenged by the isolation of home and then met by the relative challenge of being isolated from others in school in the way they never have before, the opportunity to foster creative thought and action is really salient. So Sarah, do share with us some of the ways in which you worked on that agenda.
Yes, I think classrooms became very sterile environments when children came back to school. They sat in rows, everybody facing the front. It was as if there was another sort of isolation at school, different from the isolation at home, but children still felt isolated. There were big constraints of having bubbles. There was the lack of collaborative learning that could take place within a classroom. Children also had high levels of anxiety, wondering about why they were in school, were they going to be sent home again? And the same for teachers. What was going to happen? We also had to think about what had happened to children when they were at home. Had they had a member of their family or a close friend who had died, how did this affect their feeling about being in school? And it was Children couldn't be physical in the classroom too. They didn't have that opportunity to have movement breaks, to get up, to walk around, to physically move around. Once they were sat down, that was it. They were sat down for that lesson. So it's about adults being able to think on their feet and actually say, do we need to go outside? And actually, how much of our learning can take place outside? Which subjects can be taught outside? Why do I have to have a maths lesson sitting in rows at desks? Actually, let's go and do maths outside in that environment. And it was about teachers thinking about how they could develop their lessons and change their lessons to suit the needs of those children. How many more lessons could we teach outside? And it was then about teachers thinking on their feet, thinking about, right, what happens if it rains? Do we still go outside in the rain? Or do I teach something completely different? So it was about having rough lesson plans, but not set lesson plans that couldn't be changed. Everything had to be adaptable, where people could think and move and change them with whatever that situation was.
Reminds me of the Dan Davis work, which he did a systematic review of the environment, as it were, that enhances creativity. And one of the key things he talked about in that, did it for Learning and Teaching Scotland, was flexibility. Physical flexibility and pedagogical flexibility, and how the environment was highly significant. I mean, in his own review, he was very cognizant that many schools are working alongside partnerships. But of course, at this moment in time, there could be no partnerships because nobody could come, not traditional partnerships, at least, of partnerships in school, as it were, although there could be partnerships through virtual platforms and so forth. Do you feel as if, that was the kind of the physical and flexibility, as it were, and pedagogical flexibility was key to it for you to foster their creativity?
Definitely, I think, and also the fact that staff were flexible, it allowed the children to be flexible too, and allowed them to think in a different way. And it also allowed them to see that subjects weren't in isolation within a classroom, but actually we can move and they were still relevant to them. And things were more relevant because they used the physical environment to match and enable them to link things together.
So in some ways, Sarah, you're kind of saying to me that there's been a new opportunity through this, although there was a challenge of sterility, a challenge of isolation, challenge of everybody being obliged to catch up. You're saying that staff and kids had opportunities here to capitalize in the context and make a more creative space. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think that's about looking at new opportunities. What opportunities can we get from this? How can we change things? I think it was also easier this year because exams and assessments have been done in a completely different way. We knew we weren't following a set routine that we had to follow in the past. So actually, let's throw everything up in the air and have that opportunity to try out new things and set our own staff new challenges. I think staff had the difficulty that where we'd created a staff room that allowed collaboration and allowed staff to work together and think together and come up with things together, it was now they had to be separate. Not many staff were allowed to go into the staff room. So it was about how they could develop without feeling threatened in any way, how they could work together online, how they could meet, and actually how teachers could teach each other's classes. Although children couldn't move from class to class, actually the adult could move, especially outside. So actually, let's have somebody different teach us this to build another perspective into that teaching.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on. I mean, clearly there were challenges, there were opportunities in this context for creativity. Whether all schools seized them, I know not, but I am very sure that many of the schools that I've been working with and talking to and listening to have been highly flexible in this space, in effect, have been obliged to be so, but then have capitalized on that opportunity. I think one of the challenges here, though, is around the concept of creativity itself. I don't know to the extent to which creativity has been voiced in this context. And as the provocation document for this seminar highlights, we have to remind ourselves, we have to constantly remind ourselves and others that creativity is not the property of the arts. Much of what Sarah's been talking about being outside and combining different aspects of the curriculum, have not been framed around the arts. And interesting enough, when Kerry Chappell and I did a systematic review of creative pedagogies from the 1990s to 2018, we identified eventually 35 papers that we subject to very close scrutiny and developed some themes. Well, more of that later. But one of the interesting issues we found in those papers was that conceptually, although they were the best papers from that period, and some of the authors of those papers are sitting in the audience, or at least were listed as members to attend today. I hope they're there. But that many of the papers had kind of arguably what we described as conceptual limitations. I mean, 4 of the 35 that made the cut didn't define creativity at all. 2/3 offered a kind of generic review of creativity, linking to Anna Croft's little C work, everyday creativity. Some took a more psychological theorizing perspective on creativity, and some took a more social systems definition of creativity. But intriguingly, I think the point here is that, you know, none of the reviews culminated in a working definition. So they did a serious review. The review was very well expressed often, but they didn't then say, for this study on problem solving or this study on an aspect of creativity, we see the working definition as such, and therefore we're going to look at how we're developing, or how the teachers in their study were developing creativity. Because they were kind of, it's like taking a space and saying, oh, well, we all know what creativity is. We'll give you a little bit of a literature review and then we'll move on to the study. And only 8 of the actual papers of the 35 that made the cut, only 8 gave a focused definition of the concept of creativity on the journey in order to then make an argument around it. And I think that's, you know, something to be borne in mind. I'm about to challenge Sarah on the concept of creativity in practice, but I think as researchers ourselves, we may need to be not agreeing with one common voice, but agreeing at least to commit to a particular working definition within our research papers that enables us to move the field on in relation to that frame. You can see where I'm coming from. But Sarah, I mean, and I'm conscious when we talked before, you spoke quite a lot about kind of the implicit understandings of creativity in staff rather than explicit. So over to you to just give a thought and a comment on that.
Yeah, I think for us in Finham here, we want to develop children to become lifelong learners, to see learning as not something you do in school, but to develop throughout the whole of their lives. And creativity for me is about that ethos of the school. It's here is about that exploration and teaching children to be motivated in their learning, to be self-directed, to be inquisitive, and to actually question how and what they're learning. Creativity here at Finham is about that journey of discovery for children to be able to find something new and see something new for themselves. If we look at the next slide, it's about looking at adults building on those children's ideas. So we have on the right hand picture, we have children deciding that they were going to make a boat out of a box with a broomstick. And then it was about the adult taking on board and learning from the children and taking their learning forward. So then supplying the children with other equipment to see how they can develop that concept of the boat, develop that concept of them going on a journey and exploring this further. We then used books and stories to enhance their learning. And instead of telling them the direction that they were going, we actually took the ideas and the cues from the children and then afterwards talked about what they'd learned and looked at that learning. But it's actually about taking that from the child's initiative in the first place.
Thank you. I mean, that reminds me, Sternberg describes creativity as a habit that needs encouragement and rewards. And it sounds as if the encouragement was certainly offered there. The reward was probably a deep satisfaction in the imaginative journey that they appear to be on. I love the faces of full engagement. The little guy in the yellow hat, yellow jacket seems to be really inside it. I mean, clearly what in your 2 examples there, you're immediately moving from that kind of notion of a concept of creativity to creative pedagogies to the action. But do you think staff do talk about, oh, this was, you know, they were very highly creatively engaged, or is that an implicit understanding rather than explicitly discussed?
I really think that depends on the adult within school, and that's what we're working on at the moment. I think we started off with some teachers who saw creativity as I'm learning about Greeks at the moment, so let's everybody make a Greek pot, all identical, all looking the same, and we've done something creative. And it's about how we look at what creativity is, and actually making our own school definition of what creativity is, and say, actually, everybody can be creative. It's not about just about doing things through the arts and making everything the same. It's about actually looking at those skills and looking at that question, what is it we want to do? What is it we want to find out? How are we going to get there along that journey? And I think that's a learning journey that we're on at the moment.
Thank you. I mean, that takes us nicely on really to the whole notion of creative pedagogies. And I've used this lovely visual from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, which currently runs a Teacher Development in the Arts fund, giving 900,000 annually for the last 4 years to 6 groups of schools working together with arts partners. And they are working on the arts, and unashamedly so, and wonderfully so, because they're supporting the teachers in developing their confidence and assurance as singers, as dramatists, as storytellers, as dancers, for example, in the various projects that are very diverse. And I wanted just to use this visual to highlight the kind of equitable partnerships that they're seeking to develop between schools, between arts organisations, cultural organisations, and artist practitioners. A really clearly pitch at a level playing field where we are all learners. And the arts partners don't work with the children. They work with the teachers to support their artistic learning journey themselves, teacher creativity. In that review that I referred to that Kerry and I undertook, we identified 7 different features of creative pedagogical practice according to the research literature across those many years. And Sarah and I don't have time to zoom in on all of them, but we decided to focus in on a couple, and the 2 we're going to focus in most on, well, 3 in fact, are problem solving, risk taking, and teacher creativity themselves. That sense of, because we were very aware post-pandemic of teachers taking that professional agency to more creatively respond to the challenging situation they were in. And although the PHF work doesn't have a creativity lens, as it were, many of the projects that I've been involved in observing and been privileged to visit talk openly about their own creative engagement, their own reflection on their creative learning journeys. So let's move us on to that whole focus on teacher creativity and risk-taking. Kerry and I found that this was one of the core findings of the review, where teachers were positioned in various projects to engage themselves and to engage as either creativity as a kind of creative teacher, as a background present, or as a model and a source of authenticity, right through to the teacher being highly creative as a sort of strong force within that classroom context. I want to just give you a couple of examples of that. In a study by Henriksen and Mishra, 2015, they argued that the expert teachers and theirs actively cultivated their own creative mindsets in order to support the young people. They use the phrase, they teach who they are. They believe they need to develop their own creativity in order to foster the creativity of the young and position themselves as creative pedagogues fully involved in that journey. And in terms of, that one's blank. In terms of creativity, teacher creativity and risk-taking, it seems that several of the studies show that when teachers take the risk of developing their own creativity in context with other teachers, or indeed in their own, in the classroom with young people, then they're not only taking their own risk, they're fostering the risk-taking of the young people, because failure isn't failure, it's trying, it's exploring. That notion of experimentation kind of kicks in more clearly, and then answers aren't wrong and right, they're part of the journey that they're taking. So Sarah, do you have that sense of teachers in your school having taken risks either over this period of time or previously?
Yes, and I think we've tried to develop our CPD programme so that teachers within school learn through exploration. Through the eyes of a child, the way we want children to learn, we've tried to foster that development during our CPD. So it won't be necessarily that a training session is everybody sitting down and the trainer teaching them. It's about actually, let's get up, let's do it practically, let's find out things from ourselves. What have we found out? It's about, we have a belief that everybody can be creative, that creativity is something that can be learned. And it's about removing that negative connotation about what creativity is, but actually allowing staff within school to have a go and to try things out for themselves, and being allowed to take in that risk, giving them permission to take that risk. So not just following a set scheme of work, but actually teaching knowledge and skills that are relevant to the children and relevant to the community that we live in. And that teachers find different starting points to learning. We don't all have to start with a learning objective at the beginning, but actually where's a relevant place for us to start, where those children will get the most out of that learning. Encouraging children to discover their ideas and knowledge and concepts, and actually having teachers to become active participants in the learning. Teachers don't have to know everything at the beginning, but actually they're on the same learning journey that those children are on too.
It reminds me,
like celebrating that.
sorry to interrupt you, it reminds me of Erica McWilliams' work around not being a sage on the stage or a guide on the side, but as she calls it, a meddler in the middle. You know, part of the co-constructive nature of that learning journey of all of us in the classroom, rather than simply, the teacher passing on the knowledge, but being part of that knowledge co-creation. I think you wanted to comment on this one too, because it intrigued me when you did. Go for it.
That one was about teachers taking risks by allowing children to learn somewhere where they feel comfortable to learn. You know, why does all writing have to be done at a desk? And it's about, if somebody walks into their classroom, are you doing it because it looks good if somebody walks in? Or are you planning your learning which suits the needs of your children? So this is where a class teacher let children do their creative writing in a place where they felt comfortable to write. And it's about allowing yourself to take those risks. Am I going to get the same results as if everybody sits down at a table? Or actually, if I allow those children to write on the floor in the middle of the corridor where they feel comfortable, are those children going to be more successful with their work? And it's about teachers understanding that, you know, we do allow people to take those risks, and, you know, the results are worthwhile in the end.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move us on to problem solving because of time. We've got to get where we're going to. But problem solving was one of the other key findings from the Creative Pedagogies review. And very clearly, in many of the studies at least, there was a strong sense of the children finding their own problems as well as solving set problems. More actually internationally of children finding their problems, slightly more in England from Bob Jeffrey's work of children responding to a problem that had been set by the teacher. But either way, often these problems were real world problems, problems that were positioned perhaps about pollution, and then children are not solving the pollution problem, but trying to understand it better to make decisions locally. So making, moving towards social action in their own context. And I think one of the things that shocked me when you were talking, you gave me that lovely example of the year 6 who were solving their own problems. Can you give folk that sense now, Sarah, of that?
Yeah, with those year 6 children, every year our year 6 children produce a legacy of something that's relevant to them, so that they can be remembered by the school for who they are. And this year, the year 6 has decided to make a vegetable garden. And they have built the planters, they've painted them, they've designed the whole garden, and unfortunately now they've run out of money. So they can't stone it in the way they wanted to stone it. So it's about looking at enterprise. How can those children now make enough money to finish off their garden? So they've had to do work on how much money they need, and then look at what they can do to make money within school. And the go-to thing in school is always, let's have a cake sale. Let's get children to bring in cakes. Let's sell all these cakes. And we thought, no, these children thought, no, let's do something a bit different this year. Let's have an ice cream sale. So all these children are then working out how they can buy ice cream, how they can keep it cold, how much it costs to produce these ice creams. So how much are they going to charge? And then they went on to the next level thinking, what happens if people don't bring their money in for an ice cream? Is it fair for those children not to have one? So how can they overcome those barriers? What can they do to ensure that everybody has an ice cream and enjoys it together, but also with them to make enough money so that they can continue their garden and they can leave their legacy behind. So they're bringing in lots of different curriculum areas. They're learning for lots of different ways. They're moving their learning from areas to actually make sure that they produce something in the end that can be shared by everybody and kept for years to come to everybody to enjoy.
Great, lovely example. It reminded me of Anna Craft in the work I did with Kerry around possibility broad questions. You know, they want to set up their garden, but now they've got a problem. They've got to solve their own problem. And certainly the review suggested that those authentic, real world problems that had relevance to the learners' lives or relevance to what they cared about, their emotional relevance, made a difference to their commitment and to their creative engagement, trying to solve that problem. I'm going to move us on now, as we've got a few minutes to look at where we're going, and in relation to just thinking for a minute from what you described, Sarah, about the extent to which your school represents a space of, dare we say, resistance, as the document does, the provocation document, or is it against the kind of neoliberal approaches, or is it more, do you consider it to be a context in which you're making your own decisions about how to frame the curriculum, where to position the children and the learners, what opportunities to give them. And I'm just interested in the extent to which you feel you're out of step with schools around you, or indeed in alignment with them, and how you personally feel you're positioned in relation to, you know, other head teacher meetings and so on. We had an interesting debate about that, and I'm sure others would be interested.
I think creativity has, in a way, it's gone on a journey in itself. Creativity some years ago was a really popular thing. Let's move forward. And then creativity hasn't been on the agenda for a long time. I think it's now beginning to come back. You know, we share what we've done with other schools within our cluster and within our MAT. But I think it's beginning to come back again. I think the national curriculum, which we follow, is just the starting point for our learning. So yes, we have to follow, we have to do our SATs, we have to do assessment points throughout the year, but actually how we do that is up to us. I think the national curriculum is a minimum requirement, and every school needs to broaden their horizons on how they teach the curriculum and how they develop it. It's about sharing that practice. And I think that Ofsted in the new framework actually gives an entitlement to a broad and balanced curriculum. And actually, how do we achieve this? What are we teaching them and how are we doing them? And it's about focusing on the coherence and the making sense of what we're learning. And I think to be creative, you are making sense of that learning. And it's about having an acknowledgement of the importance of that cultural literacy and giving children that sense of belonging and giving that children the responsibility for their learning so that they become lifelong learners. They don't see learning as something we do in school in the classroom, but actually learning is something we want to do forever, all of our lives.
I mean, it seems to me that one of the challenges really, if we're going anywhere with this creativity agenda, is we've got to profile higher, got to give a higher profile to creative practice, to the articulation of the creative practice, to the sharing of creative practice in multiple forms. To show schools that creativity is socially mediated, as it were, and to help children, as you've been describing, learning groups on their own and teachers joining them in that co-constructive agenda. But it does seem, at least, you know, from talking to you before, that it's not necessarily a real challenge, or at least it's not necessarily a recognised challenge for head teachers to begin to share that piece, because at the moment we've got another agenda, which is catch up, which is cover, you know, the given curriculum, and the government setting high priorities for particular aspects of the core curriculum. So do you feel kind of positioned to, you know, respond to that? Or how do you, you know, do staff sort of feel like we've got to keep on with these pieces, the phonics and the mathematics, and put to one side this more flexible response that's going to foster creativity, or is fostering creativity?
I think we still need to keep plugging away at it. I think that if you are a creative school, by definition of how the children learn and how they respond to things, they have the potential to do well within those measures that the government have at the moment. I think it's about, we look at children from Finham, and every year we have a meeting with the secondary school to see how well those children have worked within year 7 at their secondary school. And they always come back and say, oh, we can tell those children who have come from Finham. And I think that's a really good thing. That's a really positive thing, that actually we don't just conform to tests and learning it, but we get children to be engaging and to want to learn and look at their learning. So they might then ask questions and be more confident with their learning as they move on.
Thank you. I mean, I think that does connect to that documenting creativity, and I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to kind of wind us up. We felt the last strand of our discussion was really focused around, or potentially at least focused around, not only profiling practice, but tracking in some way. And intriguingly, some of you may appreciate that very few of the studies in the creative pedagogies actually tracked creativity at all. So we're moving now to the final Slido poll, just to ask you really the extent to which you feel creativity is on the agenda in primary schools or not. We're inviting you to fill in the survey, and I believe it's visible to you somewhere in the screen. So if you do, we'll see it here. So creativity clearly on the agenda, a lot of people saying at primary schools, but others kicking in. So roughly speaking, oh, it's shrinking back, between about 40 and 70%. I'm trying to read the poll as it keeps moving. So nearly a quarter, a bit worryingly, colleagues saying 20% or less, at least at 5th, at least of schools who have very little sense of creativity on the agenda. Let's move to the secondary to see where that is. Rather what Sarah and I predicted as a stark contrast, 20% or less at secondary. So if I don't know what colleagues can see, but it would suggest that in primary, we have a stronger sense of creativity being clearly on the school's agenda, explicitly or implicitly, and then a massively reduced sense of that, with 77% saying that's the case for secondary, 78% at 20% or less. I hope that was of interest to folk. It was a dialogue in the making, lived at the moment, nervously delivered, I think, on both our parts, but hopefully it was interesting. And Kerry says there are some questions, so that's good news.
I just want to say a huge thank you, Teresa and Sarah, for a really, really rich discussion. I think it's given us a real insight into the coalface of what's happening in schools. Many people in the audience will also be in schools themselves, but I know there's the researchers who will have been detached from schools in the last 18 months, particularly because of COVID. So to hear how the practice is developing, and then to see that put in kind of conversation with the research from Teresa's perspective, I think is a really, sets the scene really helpfully, and moves on some of the ideas in the provocation document that we circulated before the event. So a huge thank you to you both for doing something that is perhaps a little bit more tricky than just a straight presentation, and thinking on your feet. We really, really appreciate that. So I'm going to shift to the questions. And Teresa, you will be very pleased to hear that the first question that has been firing its way, people can vote for the questions, and lots of people voting for you to answer this question. It's a question from our friend Penny Hay. And Penny is asking you, what is your working definition of creativity? That's a question that you put to Sarah as part of the school, and whether teachers had a working definition themselves. I'll give you a minute to think about that, just by also posing another question to the rest of the participants. Charlotte Hathaway, who's joining us from the States, I know, welcome Charlotte, has also asked if all the other delegates could have a think about what their definition of creativity is too. So we won't get to hear those, but Teresa, Could you give us an idea of what your working definition of
God, it's almost as if, do you think, Kerry, I don't know, I do honestly, I think that my working definition varies according to the discipline I'm focused on. So if I'm thinking about it in relation to English, that might be rather different if I'm thinking about it in relation to supporting teacher creativity per se, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
that's kind of interesting. I always think immediate came to mind was stretching our imaginative muscles. It's that sense of going beyond, of making new. And there's a lot of folk would say, you know, innovating, but I always think innovation is, as Anna would always argue, is bringing something to market. And therefore, I'm not trying to bring anything to market. I'm trying to make new in context. And that may be new for this 3-year-old or new for this 33-year-old or 53-year-old. That's got to be valued by the others in that context. So it's not new and irrelevant. It might be new, but it still could be irrelevant. So a contribution that's stretched the learner, but made that new contribution that is valued in the context in which it's been offered. It's certainly, to my mind, not a product, but a process, but sometimes it ends in products, which might be the idea, or might be something that we all make between us in some way. And I'm sure Penny's sitting there thinking, well, that's very muddling and confusing, but it is off the hook. And I don't run around with one in my head, because I kind of do feel that if I'm writing a paper about creativity in writing or creative writing, then one would want to shape what that means in the context of that paper with those young people you were working with the opportunities they had. I don't know whether that's a fudge. Can I kick it back to you, Kerry? You asked the question. What would you go for?
I would agree with you about applying different definitions dependent on where you're sitting, and sometimes disciplinarily, but also I think sometimes depending where your research paradigm hat is sitting. I mean, I certainly work across both qualitative work and post-qualitative work, and that can tweak how I would think about it. But certainly that kind of notion of imagination at the core, I think is really, really important. But also I think it's interesting that you guys kind of are reiterating the need for us to keep defining creativity and not assume that kind of definition is out there in the ether somewhere. That reminder from the systematic review. So I think this notion of definitions is still a very live one, definitely.
Sarah, what about Sarah? Can I kick over to Sarah? Because it seems not unreasonable. All three of us should have a go.
Yeah, I think it should be something that is unique and new to that person who discovers it. So it is about using their imagination. It's about finding out why and asking yourself those questions as you're in that moment and that learning. And I do think it has to be relevant to whatever that is posed at the time.
Brilliant. Yeah, I would really agree with that. And actually, as you were talking, the examples you were giving, Sarah, really reminded me of Peter Woods and Bob Jeffries' kind of work, sort of pre-possibility thinking, where they talk about the importance of ownership, relevance, and I mean, they use the term innovation, but I think that ownership and relevance idea that was coming very strongly is really important as well. So
a lot of the papers, I recall, Kerry, used the NACI definition.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's become quite popular. And I was deliberately thinking, I'm not going to use that. But, you know, it is, you know, widely repeated.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question, which is more focused on the IT issues that you brought up, Sarah. So this is particularly a question for Sarah. Firstly, saying how much, it's from Sue Dimmock, saying how much she likes the collages that you shared at the beginning. But Sue is asking about how you've managed to ensure parity of access to tech for children to speed up the development of ICT skills, because this notion of digital access has become a very live one. Certainly something that the second report of the Durham Commission has picked up on, that we're not going to manage to get better, more creativity going off the back of the pandemic if we don't have parity of access. So Sue is asking, from your point of view, Sarah, how have you been able to manage that, or have you not?
What we've done to manage that is, first of all, we asked parents who had computers at home or access. We then put out a plea to the local universities and said, has anyone got any old computers that nobody wants anymore? People brought their own in, which we then adapted and changed so that they could be used from home. We then planned our learning so that our learning wasn't live, so that if families only had one piece of equipment at home, then children could do their work when it was available for them to do it. We also planned our learning so that most of it didn't have to be done online. So therefore, the teachers would always do a video in the morning of this is what we're going to learn today, and brilliant for what you did yesterday. They had shout outs to different children who had provided work from the day before. Children then had a choice of when they did it. So we put all those subjects on and videos to match all those subjects, but children could choose the time of day that was relevant for them. So if they had another child within that house working at a different time, they could do it. We also planned our activities so most of them were as practical as they possibly could be. So they didn't have to be sitting at a computer for many hours of the day. For those children who didn't have computers, if we couldn't provide them with one from school or from one of the charities that provided them for us, then we sent their learning home for them to do. So we would do their learning with paper copies, or we would phone parents and discuss it with the parents over the phone.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I think that indicates the level of work needed to try and address that sort of digital access issue, and that really shouldn't be underestimated, I think. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
It does
Sarah.
mean too, Kerry, doesn't it, that the huge amount of hands-on you're referring to there. I mean, there's lots of creativity research that suggests that hands-on is critical to the enterprise. It may be that, you know, with those children who didn't have access, they had more opportunity to be hands-on. I'm not saying you can't be creative with technology. I'm simply saying, you know, they had another set of opportunities there that might not have been available in the classroom in quite the same way.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think your point, I think you said the Chartered College put out resources about being off screen, Teresa, and I think that's quite a sort of key point halfway through the lockdown, that actually not having everything online, you know, having that balance was really important. So
there's an excellent presentation by a colleague who did something, Chartered College, I've forgotten their name, from UCL, I think, on outdoor learning. And it was just superb, and how much you can learn outdoors, which is exactly what you were highlighting, Sarah. Although creativity wasn't seen to be the lens through which she was doing it, there was no question it was fostering children's creativity.
Okay, I'm going to shift us on and try and squeeze in one more question. There's a few questions on definitions which we have already had a chat about. So I'm going to pick a slightly different question from Petra Vakova. Petra is asking a question about flexibility. One of the things that was coming through in your dialogue was this idea that teachers had more space to be creative, etc. But Petra's actually asking how much flexibility was there in reality. And I think perhaps it goes back to some of the duty of care issues that Teresa was touching on, the amount of energy and effort it took to provide all these different options. So Petra's asking about flexibility kind of in reality, and what might restrict teachers' flexibility, and how we can address that going forward.
I mean, certainly one of the things that's definitely restricting them now is the expectation that, you know, we've got to focus, or schools are expected to focus on catch up. But I mean, it's ever thus that if schools wish to independently pioneer their way forward, which is what you've been doing, Sarah, and indeed many, many schools more are now, who are taking the decision that they have found routes to new opportunities for learning for their young people, and therefore offering more staff flexibility and more student flexibility, at least in their voices, in their responses, in conversations. And Sarah, what do you think? I mean, was it real, the flexibility staff had, or was there kind of a, you know, a remit nonetheless underneath it?
I think staff did have flexibility. I think they had to think about what had to be taught, what did children need to know, and what was the best way of teaching children those things. So therefore, it was there was flexibility there, but there were also guidelines that we had to follow. So staff could not throw the curriculum out the window and say, we're not doing any of that. But they actually had to look at the curriculum and say, this is where we are now. This is what children need to learn, which is the best way for them to learn that. And if they're learning at home, or if they're learning at the new way schools had to be set up, actually, what's going to make them remember what they've learnt? What's going to make that experience relevant to them, so they remember what it is they've been taught. I think the idea of catch-up curriculum isn't let's cram as much in as we possibly can. It's about looking at, these are where my children are now. This is what my children know. And actually, this is what they need to know in the future. So actually, how can we link things together to actually make sure those children are where they need to be?
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. I think we're going to have to wrap up the questions there. But again, a huge thank you, Teresa and Sarah, for kind of setting the scene, the coalface, as I said, between research and practice. It's a real insight into the conversation from your two worlds. So thank you so much for giving us your time and energy on that today. There are multiple other questions in the Slido. So what I'm going to suggest is, if people would like to transfer their questions from the Slido into the mural, we can have a dialogue in the background, if you would like, where Teresa or Sarah can pitch into the conversation on the mural, but equally other people can respond to those questions that remain outstanding from the Slido. So if you would like to do that, please do continue chatting on some of those themes in the mural. But what I would like to do now is move us on to our next contribution to the event. Really delighted to welcome Professor Bill Lucas from the Centre for Real World Learning at the University of Winchester. And Bill is going to kind of zone out a little bit and take a more national and international perspective on these two questions that we're drilling down in. Where are we now and where are we going? So I'm going to hand over to Bill. Off you go. Thanks very much, Bill.
Kerry, thank you very much. And Teresa and Sarah, thank you so much for the dialogue that we started. I've got 3 questions for you, quick questions, just to get the sense of where we all are. The first is about where you think we are in terms of our international acknowledgement of creativity. So now's the time to choose one of those 4 options, from stuck in the slow lane to making terrific progress. And once you think you've had enough time, then we'll move on to the national UK picture. And finally to the picture in England. Oh, where I'm sensing a certain stuckness in a certain slow lane, or at least only modest progress. Thank you so much. And Met, thanks so much for doing that. I'm hoping I now have control. I do. That's great. Thank you very much. So in my half an hour, what I'd like to do is to give you a kind of a world overview of some of the issues to do with our topic today. Where are we and where are we going? And of course, as Teresa rightly reminds us, you know, what do we not know? So that we keep these questions open. And it would hardly be surprising if I were to remind you, I picked year 7. It's kind of in the middle of an imaginary timetable from early years right through to 18. And of course, it doesn't appear on the timetable as a subject because it operates slightly differently from being a subject. And I will attend to the definition question in a moment. And I want to suggest that, and let's just see if this is going to work. Yes, splendid. I want to suggest that there are a number of ways or a number of aspects of this journey, which we may want to have views on in terms of where we are and where we're going. And the first is, and has been mentioned already, is around definition, and not just definition, but what it looks like in terms of progression. The second is how it sits within disciplines and contexts. And I was fascinated that one of the definition answers was, well, it will depend in which discipline I'm in. And of course, we're not just talking about the formal curriculum, but we're also talking about informal learning opportunities. we're talking and have been really thoughtfully informed about different pedagogies. And that's not just a question of pedagogies for certain aspects of creativity in certain contexts, but also the age issue. There may be some things that work better for younger children and some for older students. I think this is the area where we've possibly made some progress in the last decade. There's an assessment issue, I'm sure, and it's been there in the background. There's a staff capability issue. I don't mean that in an HR sense. I mean that in their confidence and professional capability. And then finally, and I think this is particularly acutely the case in England, there are various accountability pressures that any head teacher or senior member of staff or indeed teacher will need to manage, as well as our ability to continue to use evidence to improve. So on each of those kind of areas, I'm going to land sometimes briefly, sometimes for a little longer time. So spoiler alert, what I'm going to argue is that actually we've made terrific progress internationally. The UK, especially Wales, making really interesting progress right now. Scotland's curriculum for excellence has been there for a while. England has been in the slow lane, and an optimist in me is now saying we might just be inching our way out of the slow lane. I hope I can persuade you of that. Let's start in an international place and start with three well-known overviews of what you might expect to see in a contemporary curriculum. And in each of them, in different ways, you'll see that creativity is significantly present. Here's the World Economic Forum's version. And in this framing, creativity is a competency. Let's not get distracted by the language. There are so many different nouns describing whatever creativity is. I'll have my own go at that later on. But here it's linked with critical thinking, communication and collaboration. And that owes some thought, some original thinking to the curriculum for the Centre for Curriculum Redesign, which I'll come to in a second. The OECD has a different but overlapping version of this and is looking at not foundational literacies, but technical know what and know how, more perhaps emphasis on affective, so social emotional learning, and then a cluster of things which it's calling creativity and critical thinking. At the Centre for Curriculum Redesign, which I mentioned just now, and its 4 C's, and another related concept of character, and quite a lot of things in character that I'd probably personally stick into creativity. And I don't think creativity is a skill. I think it does have skills. I think, another spoiler alert, creativity is a habit of mind or a disposition, or all knowledge and all dispositions and habits of mind are made up of skills which we start tentatively and overtly to practice, and then they become second nature and habits and ultimately dispositions. UNICEF has its own version too, where creativity is a subset of learning. Some of my colleagues would have learning as a subset of creativity. But you see there is the word that Teresa was mentioning, problem solving, which I think is part of this, and whether it's part of learning or part of creativity or a close cousin, you know what, I'm not sure it really matters. And I am sure we can dangerously get down into the weeds of the pond of the curriculum if we're not careful. So in short, in the last decade, international curriculum thinking, now increasingly manifest in countries such as Australia, has creativity or creative thinking, or in this case, critical and creative thinking, as a central part of the national curriculum. In countries like Australia, of course, all matters are ultimately determined by states. So although their curriculum body, ACARA, may have specified progression, and here you can see on 2 sides of A4, here's the first side, divided into sub-elements. So here is your definition of creativity. It's about inquiring. It's about generating ideas. It's about reflecting on thinking and processes, and it's about analysing and synthesising. The national curriculum lands, for example, in the state where I do most work, in the state of Victoria. It lands in a progression document, in this case, one side of A4, where it is broken down into questions and possibilities, reasoning, and metacognition. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked, but I think creativity as a concept at one end attracts people who are more interested in pure divergent thinking, and they might well term it creativity. And at the other end, those who are probably more interested in convergent thinking, and they may be more related to phrases like critical thinking. Australia bypasses this elegantly by calling it critical and creative thinking. I probably prefer creative thinking or creativity, but again, I'm not going to get het up about the nouns we use or the descriptions we use of the concept itself. In Alberta, you see another close cousin here, innovation. That's the word that's used in Singapore, for example. But you'll see nice, not just definitions, but examples of what it might look like from a pupil or student's perspective. So you've got examples of, and these are almost, or could easily become self-report questions or rubrics that might be used in conversations between teachers and students to track back to Teresa's question about that earlier on, the progression of creativity over time. Now, a number of countries across the world are beginning to specify creativity and things like creativity. And you either see it in the mission statement of a curriculum or in the kind of skills that are identified, or specifically in aspects of the curriculum. Not just the arts, interestingly, internationally, much broader, especially in the STEM subjects, and increasingly, but still a small proportion, actually scope and sequence and progression documents. The most recent analysis of this by the Brookings Institution, I think this is last year, taking the Centre for Curriculum Redesign model, shows that creativity is included in 21 jurisdictions, specifically identified in subjects in 12, mapped progression, and then you see that column of zeros. So we shouldn't be surprised that the systematic review mentioned already found some difference about interpretation and not yet consistency about assessment. There's also a clear a column of zeros there in the assessment accounting as well. Now, we've had this definition mentioned already, the Nazi one. If you like, Ken Robinson's heritage, imaginative activity fashioned so as to produce outcomes that are both original and of value. And I remember at that time thinking that some teachers found the notion of, am I being original, a difficult one? And I liked Sarah's accommodation there, that it's whether it's original for the individual concerned. I think that's much closer to the little c and a craft conception. And value too, some people were uncertain about what was meant by value. In my work at PISA at the OECD, we've defined creativity, or creative thinking as we're calling it, in this way. So engaging productively in the generation, evaluation, and improvement of ideas that can result, not do, it's not necessarily leading to a product, that can result in original and effective solutions, in advances in knowledge, and in impactful expressions of imagination. We've left, as to who that impact is related, we've left that an open question quite deliberately so that we can be a little more subjective about that. By the way, you can tell that is a definition arrived at by a committee. That's another story which I'm very happy to talk about, but not now. In our work, and I was privileged that Anna was on our advisory board when we first started our work a decade ago. That's Guy Claxton, myself, and Ellen Spencer. And our work does owe or stands on the shoulders of folk like researchers like Lauren Resnick, like Bob Sternberg, already mentioned in his notion of habit, like David Perkins at Harvard, Art Costa, and of course Anna herself. And ours is of 5 habits of mind: imaginative, inquisitive, persistent, collaborative, and disciplined, each with their sub-elements, each sub-element of which has a kind of obvious knowledge and skill component. Not time, forgive me, to go through those now. And I'm not saying that this definition is in and of itself progress, but it is, interestingly, one of the most, if not the most widely used ones in schools across the world now. And that's partly to do with the generosity of the OECD in, first of all, publishing it and then using it as the model of for a 4-year study, which I'll come on to in a second. The model has now gone as far afield. This is Chile, a little place called Frutillar, and translated into Spanish. Here we are in Perth, also in the Southern Hemisphere in Western Australia. And it's being used as in a sort of metacognitive sense as children curate the development of their own creativity, and they've been doing a fun outdoor activity, more of outdoors later on in this presentation. Perhaps the most well-developed example in the Southern Hemisphere is Rooty Hill High School, almost identically similarly advanced in London at Thomas Tallis School, where we have a long-standing relationship. And here you can see, and I'm just going to bring up one aspect of this model. You can see a school has taken the model and has run with it and worked with it and applied it and developed it. And you can see from the legend here, they're trying to develop a common language for creativity. These are the verbs that appear in the center of the model. Then the creativity disposition, then the sub-disposition, and then the kind of turquoisey color, the penultimate ring moving outwards, is opportunities for young people to develop their creativity. So this is a sort of an opportunity tracking mechanism for teachers trying to ensure, this is a busy secondary school, that this can happen. And then final ring, and I'll come on to this later too, taking ideas from Ron Richard and colleagues at Project Zero, that creativity and creative habits are too abstract, especially in the primary classroom. It's really helpful to break them down into simple thinking routines. I'm honored to say that the model now is in use in 35 countries across the world, and often thanks to the help of our friends and colleagues at Creativity, Culture and Education. It formed the basis of work over 4 years at the OECD, a year preparing, 2 years in a series of field trials, and then a year in analyzing and writing up. And just a kind of headline sense of some of the conclusions of that. And this is a free-to-air book if you want to just Google that title, very easy to get hold of. That it can be taught and it can be assessed. More about the assessment in a second. Really helpful to be intentional, and rubrics seem to be found to be extremely useful by teachers in becoming more precise. Professional learning, unsurprisingly, vital. It takes time, and don't you know it, there's no one way of doing it. In terms of at the sharper lesson level, here are some of the findings, and I particularly, and this goes back to some of the work that Anna was doing 2 decades ago, I think, in possibility thinking, and I'm thinking of a collection of essays she edited and I contributed to, where we talked about leaving room for the unexpected and space and time for reflection. Seems to be so important, and was coming out of some of the things that Sarah was saying earlier on. Here's the paper that's been alluded to already, Teresa and Kerry's excellent work here. And she's already mentioned problem solving and intimated autonomy. I think almost all have this idea of generating and exploring ideas. Guy Claxton and I, when pushed, used to say that being creative is being able to have an idea when you need it. As simple as that. And when it comes to understanding pedagogies, again, more in a moment. But in terms of assessment, you may or may not be aware that it is now assessed in the state of Victoria every year. This is not a high stakes assessment. This is a kind of rising tide assessment, a bit like a PISA. It's anonymous, so schools and kids don't know, but with some very sophisticated and very clever tests produced by the Australian Council for Educational Research. Critical and creative thinking is now assessed. I've been privileged again to work with them over the last decade. And that work has influenced the new framework for PISA 2022 because of the pandemic, obviously. And here we're locating creativity. We're offering it in terms of modes of expression, both written and visual. And in terms of location, science we've chosen just to kind of fracture expectation. And social is a synonym really for common sense, because if you locate it in a subject, you end up, if you're not careful, having the test as a proxy for maths or literacy or science or something else. In my own work, and most recently in the movement I've co-founded with my friend and colleague Peter Hyman, Rethinking Assessment, we've been developing a much richer palette of methods for teachers to use to evidence the development of creativity in young people. Assessing or evidencing or tracking the progression of creativity is not to be reduced, I would suggest, to a letter 3B or a score 3B. That would be nonsensical. But there are a whole host of ways in which we can become more precise and more rigorous. And I hope as we develop this, better at cultivating creativity in young people of all ages. Now, honing in on the national part of this story, I think the emerging curriculum in Wales is one of the most exciting curricular advances taking place at the moment. Creativity is explicitly part of this. I'm in a very interesting debate doing some work with Wales at the moment in thinking about how best to deal with interdisciplinarity and how best to deal with these big 4 pillars on which the curriculum sits, one of which is enterprising and creative contributors. Watch this space, but I'm very excited by what's going on in Wales. I'm also excited by the Durham Commission, which it was my privilege to be part of and co-author this first report. And you had the second report, which if you've not mentioned and not read, do have a look at. Very strong on equity and on things digital and on understanding the impact of COVID. And here are the Durham definitions. 3 kinds of definition: the abstract noun, the process, and explicitly teaching for creativity. And I think that's a helpful distinction, but I might say that, mightn't I, because I was part of helping to create that. And I'll say more about how Durham is landing in schools as I move towards the end of this presentation. The Creativity Exchange is a new website which I'm proud to curate and which is featuring practice either in the form of case studies or opinion pieces or more scholarly pieces. The first, I'm delighted to say, was an interview, an online interview with Kerry and Teresa, and a featuring of their work on creative pedagogies. Do have a look if you haven't. I'm really excited about this. Here, I mean, we're not going back to creative partnerships 2 decades ago, but we're going forward into a serious, systematic investment into how best to do this at more scale than individual schools. So the Creativity Collaboratives is launched. Expressions of interest will be being looked at this week. I'm delighted to be a part of that process, and we've been overwhelmed in a good way with a huge number of expressions of interest, and quite soon we'll be going back out to schools and encouraging some of those to develop well worked up proposals. And I think we're going to build an English professional learning community of educators, universities, cultural and scientific partners, helping schools really to do this even better. Now, to conclude, I think in terms of where we are, in terms of that initial process of definition, of embedding, of pedagogy, of assessment, here's where I think we are. I think we're beginning, that paper on the left is from the College of Teachers Impact Journal, which has been mentioned already. I think we're beginning to get a sense of there being a cyclical process. This makes it look a bit linear, ironically, but I think from the work that we're doing across the world, we're clear that you need a real understanding. You need to invest in the culture and the climate, really focusing on pedagogy, and then building student agency as we go along. And here's the mirror image to the Sydney model. This is Thomas Tallis's model, and this is their expression of stage one. We define and we own from a local perspective what it means and what it looks like in our context in South London, in London. And what it looks like in London may be different from what it looks like and feels like in Sarah's school in Coventry. And that's great. It should do. It should be different. But I'm hoping increasingly there are some core components. And imagination is one, and asking questions is another. And the social element, the collaboration, I think is one. I think the persistent metacognition, resilience aspect is part of it. And I think the fact that it's learnable and requires practice, the disciplined end of it, is one of it too. I can point you to good evidence on all of those matters. In Western Australia, we've taken this model and we've started to develop templates for schools to use to customize and develop their own. And that's happening in a cluster, in actually a creativity cluster in Perth as we speak right now. I think looking at the research to which, of course, Anna herself contributed so wonderfully, I think we're becoming clearer about some of the elements here. And here I'm synthesizing work from about half a dozen different researchers and the most recent OECD work that I've been part of. I do think leaving space for the unexpected cannot be overestimated. And I think that, and this is, of course, a challenge for some colleagues, actively engaging students as co-designers is critically important. Be very interested in feedback from you all in a second. I think there are three key interwoven parts of what seems to be happening when it works well. One, it's about teaching knowledge and creativity. It's what Guy Claxton and I call split screen teaching. We're teaching the tutors, but we're also understanding critical thinking about where the sources of these evidence, this apparent evidence came from. We're teaching science, but we're also inviting you to speculate and exercise your questioning muscles. We're teaching English, and we're going through the or drama or dance, improvising, or science or engineering prototyping, and we're inviting you to go through the disciplined process of moving from one idea to a better idea to an even better idea, and so forth. One of my favorite sculptors is Andy Goldsworthy, and here is his lovely dry stone wall in a forest, which for me is a metaphor for what we're trying to do. So creativity, or rather the skills or habits of mind of creativity, are embedded in the forest that is the school curriculum, and increasingly seamlessly emerging from that lake and then disappearing into the blue yonder. I think the work of Project Zero is helpful here. So I think if you're trying to say, so what does it look like to inquire more deeply, then to start small with think, puzzle, explore is a really helpful way of doing it. Or I think if you're trying to get into routines for critical thinking, then think, pair, share, or indeed routines for exploration, then those would be good examples. There are many, many more. If you go to the Visible Thinking site, you can get them yourself. And I think that we're beginning to have a better idea about which pedagogies work for which aspects of this. And I know there's more work to be done here. In our own work, we've begun to curate this in this way. And in Teaching Creative Thinking, we've got quite detailed case studies showing schools that have been at this for a while and where they've got to in their thinking on this. And some of these pedagogies come from drama and the arts, some come from science, some come from design thinking, some come from engineering, and some come from almost every field that you can think of, but they land in a place in your school in a way that seems to begin to develop the creative habits of mind of young people. It's not just in the classroom, it's outside the classroom. Here's an example of some work we've been doing, the Royal Yachting Association, where creativity is seen as one of the outcomes, along with teamwork and other things, of learning to sail. I'll just mention one case study example from Zest for Learning, and then we're nearly there. This is one of my favorite schools, and it takes us outside. This is featured in Zest for Learning, and I think we need more of that. Joie de vivre, back in school. We want a leveling out agenda as well as a leveling up. All this talk of lost learning and lockdown is deeply hurtful, I think, and underestimates the extraordinary work that schools have been doing. We need to keep the curriculum broad and expansive, and if possible, outdoors. In an earlier life, I founded and ran Learning Through Landscapes, so I declare interest here. This, colleagues, is 120 acres of marshland managed by an extraordinary school, West Rise Junior School on the edge of Eastbourne, Times Ed Primary School of the Year in 2015. Here are the children getting to know water buffalo close up and personal, and learning extraordinary things about the world out there and the world in here. And if I wanted to pull all this together, then in work that I'm currently doing with my colleague Louise Stoll and colleague Alan Spencer at the University of Winchester, we've just produced or haven't published yet, but finished a systematic review of some of the evidence here of creative leadership in schools. Or is it leadership of creative schools, or is it all those things? Yes, it is all those things. And yes, it is helpful when teachers both teach more creatively and are more creative in their practice. But here would be my summation, interim summation, because we're just now going back to promising practices for a much more detailed qualitative study. And we're going to put all this together so that I hope if you ask me in December this year, we'll be able to give a richer answer to this just headline set of rubrics or heuristics, if you like, which I hope you might find helpful as we go forward together. So thank you so much for listening. Do have a look at the Creativity Exchange if you've not already done so. That's where I am. Do talk to me. I'm reasonably friendly and very happy to engage with you. And thanks ever so much for listening. I wonder if Met could just take off the slide now. And if there are questions, I'd be only delighted with other colleagues to do my best to respond.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was a really fantastic presentation. I think you've really brought us through the kind of national and international perspectives and practices of creativity. It was really interesting. Thank you so much. We do have some questions which I'm going to put forward to you now, if that's okay, from everybody watching the presentation. We have one actually from my colleague Kerry, which we'll kick off with. She asks, why the focus on verbal and written in the model of assessment that you presented, and why not include embodied or other ways of knowing too?
Another piece of work I'm just completing is a systematic review of practical learning in schools. And I'm a big fan, or I believe in Head, Heart and Hand. The answer is terribly simple, Kerry, because it's an online 1-hour test. And so for us, it was a triumph to get visual in as well as written. So we've got another mode to get in, but simply just not possible within the constraints of the brief we were given.
Could you tell us a little bit more, Bill, about, I mean, you've just mentioned there that it was a struggle to even get the visual into that. Why was that kind of like difficult for other people, potentially not quite to understand the importance of visual, or as Kerry's kind of mentioned, embodied, physical, the non-physical ways of knowing and being? So
I need to just take a step back, and for colleagues not familiar with PISA, PISA, colleagues will know, I'm sure, of its literacy, numeracy and science incarnation, and every 3 years since 2015 2012 actually, has been undertaking a fourth test in what it describes as the innovative domain, so an area of promising practice that it wishes to see featured more in schools, and which seems to have reached a state of robustness in terms of its definition, that it might be more carefully evidenced and assessed. A good example of this would be 2015 collaborative problem solving. The top end of this, the PISA test, is a standardized test for 15-year-olds, which takes an hour and is online. And it's accompanied by various more qualitative questionnaire responses from school leaders and from students themselves. So that the constraints are huge. So it has to be a 1 hour online, or if not online, as in attached to the internet, a computer test. And of course, it cannot be attached to the internet in some parts of the world, although less so now. That's becoming easier. And it is also translated into all the languages of the PISA countries. It is about the most complex endeavor I've ever had a tiny hand in, certainly more so than constructing field trials in England for our model of creativity. I'm coming at it largely as a thinker about creativity and education, and I'm working alongside test developers, and I'm working alongside budget holders, and the three have to sit as cooperatively together as possible, Victoria, and compromises are made. And what I'm really dreaming of is that, as with collaborative problem solving, although this is a summative test, this PISA test, it will spawn and give weight to formative assessment of creativity, because I'm frankly really interested in that. I'm interested in how can teachers develop better dialogue tools to help children and young people better articulate how far they are along a journey towards where they and more skilled others want to get to in terms of creativity. So it's a curious experience, and I'm glad I'm only doing it once, but I'm hoping it will offer some contribution and comfort to those who wish to see creativity further up the educational pecking order.
Absolutely. Thank you for that response, Bill. I can only imagine how difficult it is to try to think about measuring creativity in such a kind of short space of time and on an online kind of platform as well. But it does also give room to think about different ways of assessing creativity within our classrooms. But I want to focus on some more questions and not take up the time myself. So another question that we have from Rob Thompson asks, are there potential conflicts with an English education system built around accountability and performativity? How do we shift thinking at government level?
The
big question.
Okay, so the answer to your first question, Rob, is yes. And to the second question is I don't know, but I'll try and be a little bit more subtle than that. Sarah is an example of a head teacher who's doing this despite, and I can think of, without exaggerating, in the hundreds of fantastic school leaders who are doing this despite. And when I say despite, I mean the current accountability structure, especially Ofsted, and especially what happens at 16 plus, at Attainment 8 and Progress 8. And although that's only a smaller number of schools than primary, it has a curious downward reducing impact on, I think, creativity throughout the system. That does have a negative impact. It has a negative impact in obvious ways, because back to the practical point, it is squeezing out practical learning in big time, I think. But that's a subject for another conversation. I think related to it, because one of our metrics, predominant metrics, is success in a certain kind of high stakes exam. Let's call them GCSE for the sake of argument at the moment. And those are almost entirely in the moment. They're like PISA. They're in the moment, except they're pencil and paper. Tests hugely of recall, very little application of that. Interesting, I've just doing some work looking at the science GCSE and being astonished at how much stuff there is in there. not doing the things that we were doing even a decade ago in acknowledging coursework and development over time and drafting and prototyping and improvising, all those kinds of things. So the assessment system is not fit for purpose, and the accountability system is not fit for purpose. That said, there is evidence, and I've produced a paper which I'm very happy to share, and it draws on some really good work by Ron Beghetto and colleagues looking at the relationship between effective teaching of creativity and achievement. And there's a little bit that John Hattie's done recently on that too. And unsurprisingly, if you believe creativity is about thinking, questioning and thinking new thoughts, don't be surprised if creatives don't do very well on a testing regime which wishes to know the answer in advance. Interestingly, critical thinking and some of the work that the Education Endowment Foundation has done on philosophy for children, for example, Stephen Gorard and Steve Higgins and colleagues have shown actually does produce gains in achievement. So the first, in terms of government, here's what I'm trying to say. One, watch the Durham Commission space, because these experiments are going to try to evidence that this is not a binary alternative. We can have young men and women who are more creative and better at science and geography and all the rest of it, and as Sarah was implying, better lifelong learners. So I think there's a kind of throughput here. And two, we simply have to get out of our slow lane and think about international competition. The rest of the world thinks that being more creative is a desirable attribute or disposition. We have to get alongside them.
Thank you, Bill. I think more than ever, if anything, COVID has shown us is the importance of creativity and innovation for lifelong learning. And you're absolutely right. If we want to be on that international scale, then that's something that should be recognised in our assessment mechanisms that we have in this country. Absolutely. I'm going to move on to one final question, because we have one last question and it's received lots of votes on the panel here. So Sarah's asked, how do these definitions of creativity span cultures? Is there anything specifically Western in the approach that doesn't map globally?
Yes, there is. And this is a very complex question and a very good question. And it's one, so in PISA, the first round of field trials are done in English-speaking countries, and the second in, although there's cultural variety obviously there, and the second is in the wide variety of cultures and language that are represented in the OECD or part of the PISA family. And one simple example is if most Western views of creativity see the expression of individuality and the exercising of your questioning muscles, as it were, as being an aspect of curiosity and creativity in action. In some cultures, that would seem to be an affront to the status quo, or a challenge to those who are in positions of authority. And certainly the means by which you expressed a difference of opinion would be very different. That would be one example. And in some cultures too, where there is a greater emphasis on the collegial and the collective and the social, as opposed to the individual and the heroic, there will be very different emphases on the degree to which creativity is a phenomenon that is part of a social phenomenon. So the simple answer is yes, and it's extremely complex, which is actually another reason why we had to put the boundaries in terms of our definitions of scope for the Creative Thinking PISA 2022 test.
Thank you so much, Bill. Do we have time for one last question? Maybe we have time for one last question, I think, because there's so many coming in now. And
I like the one last question.
I know, yeah. We always have to do that. We're going to stretch it just for one last little question here, because quite a few have started to come in. I'm going to go to one from Pam Bernard. She's asked here, conceptualizations of creativity and signature pedagogies may well be hijacked by human exceptionalism ? So maybe that's a bit more of a comment, but she also says, What does it mean to be more creative?
Hi, Pam. Good to hear your question. Yes, any human exceptionality can hijack anything. I think the use of the word signature could be over-egging it, but certainly families or clusters of ways of being, teaching and learning that are promising would be a phrase or a set of words that I'd be increasingly confident in suggesting have some usefulness. It's such a big and interesting question you asked that in the minus 30 seconds that I've just seen we've got, I can't do justice to it, but love to continue the dialogue with you outside this.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you everybody who's been asking their questions. Just to remind you that if you have any questions, you can add them over to the mural board, which during our break in 15 minutes time, we will be continuing to interact with your questions there. But just to finish up this session from Bill, I want to thank him very much for sharing all of his insight into creativity and all of his work over these many years. It's been really fascinating, Bill. Thank you so much. I will give you a clap by myself, but I'm sure that everybody else is virtually clapping you as well. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you so much, Victoria.
Okay, and it's my very warm welcome to bring back into this conversation my co-conveners, Joe and Kerry.
Hello. So I think I'm going to kick off this section. Is that right?
You are indeed, Joe. Yes, please.
So I'm picking up the first of our questions in the provocation document, which was where are we now? And there's really just three things I feel have been strongest in my mind listening to the discussions from today, the different perspectives that we've had insight into, different kinds of expertise coming from different places. But the things that kind of are strongest to me in terms of where we're at the moment is the fact that it's perhaps not unsurprising for an event that's located in the UK that in some ways we are we have a particular perspective, and I think one of the issues we have is one which is one that is located too much in England, needs to connect and look out and relate more internationally. So it feels to me that there are lessons, not just in terms of practice that's going on, but also attitudinal in terms of the way in which we're conceiving of the curriculum and thinking about problems, thinking about where learning happens. So that relationship between the UK perspective, particularly the English perspective, and the international one seems to be something very significant in terms of where we are at the moment. And the next thing is around this notion of definitions, what it is that we understand. I think what we've learned from today, what we've been reminded of, is that how our understandings are important for us to articulate in order to communicate effectively, but that understanding is always contextual, cultural, and also contingent. And so reminding ourselves of the need to articulate that and to help our communications by that. And then the other thing really is around this, the sense of the breadth and depth of those characterizations that we've experienced. So one of the points we had in our provocation document was around the idea of creativity being defined as connecting knowledge to generating new ideas, problem solving, and a lifelong approach to learning, which of course nobody seems to have disagreed with, but it feels that in some ways what we've found from today is an expansion of that. You know, viewing that more broadly, the fact that, you know, for example, the varied responses that Sarah illustrated in her response to how did she deal with IT, Bill's responses to the way in which the body is included, the particular examples of Thomas Tallis and Rooty Hill High. In each of those contexts, we've got this sense of the breadth and the depth of what's going on. So I think it's reminding us that we've got all that richness to work from. I'm going to pass over to Victoria now, who I think is taking the next question. Is that right?
I'm indeed. Thank you, Joe. So the next question from our provocation document was, where are we going? And during the presentations, there were a number of key things that for me became quite apparent. The social dimensions of creativity seem to be really quite important in practice at this particular moment in time. And Sarah very eloquently spoken about that in terms of the young people that she was working with in her school. But I think more broadly across all of education at the moment, we are understanding the need for a greater understanding of that social dimension and that social dimension of creativity and how important that is at this moment in time. As part of that and linked to that is this notion of young people as co-designers in their learning, in curriculum. And actually also we've had a kind of step change in the way that learning has been done over the past year. We have had a lot of home learning, so there's been a lot more parental involvement in the teaching of our young people. And therefore there is a lot more voices that we need to consider in the learning journey and involvement of them within the creation of curriculum, for example. We've also had quite a few discussions today about the resistance to certain sort of frameworks that are kind of bounded, or we think our teaching and learning practices are bounded by. And actually it goes back to that first point, that particularly what everybody's been talking about today really is to resist these sort of frameworks and boundaries that we think are there within the curriculum, that we need to be more responsive and response able to young people as well. So giving them more ownership really starts to resist those frameworks. We need to give creativity different sort of spaces for it to be engendered and explored. And Sarah very eloquently again spoke about the significance and affordances of different physicality of spaces. So learning has had to move outside, for example, and Bill touched on this too. In many of the project examples that he put forward to us today, is that examples of different spaces where creativity can be engendered. Then finally, we move on to the notion of inter or transdisciplinarity in the curriculum. And Bill started to touch upon this when he was speaking about the development of the new Welsh curriculum and how subjects are not necessarily starting to be seen as something that is siloed, but something that now is starting to be explored more cross-disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. Are there interactions that are being explored or intra-actions? And all of these things are changes that are starting to happen. Now, one of the questions that was put forward to Bill was about the assessment issues and management of accountability pressures. But internationally, Bill has shown us that there has been a new kind of thinking around creativity, and that creativity is starting to be seen as an integral part of national curriculums in other jurisdictions. So assessment issues have started to move on in other international countries, and now potentially this time moving forward, it is our time in England and nationally for us to think about what those new mechanisms might be moving forward. I'm going to pass over to Kerry.
Thanks, Victoria. So the question that I'm going to wrap up on is this notion of what can we do better, and it interrelates strongly with some of the key points that both Jo and Victoria have brought through so far. But I think going back to the beginning, I think Teresa's call from the Systematic Lit Review to really think about, I think for the research community to think about how we define creativity. I think it was very surprising when we did that Lit Review that researchers were not defining a key term in their papers. You know, it's the fundamental of what we do, surely. So actually, I think that's a really important, what can we do better as researchers is really think about our definitions. And as you know, all of us were discussing in that first session, that might shift and change, but actually, you know, trying to put some notion down of what you're talking about in a particular context, as Jo was saying, making sure you understand the situatedness of creativity is really important, because the more we talk about what we mean by that fundamental term, the more we can allow for a plurality of definitions. So there I'm referring to the provocation document, where there was a real call from that meeting of experts before today to try to make sure that we don't end up with a one-size-fits-all definition of creativity that sort of gets used internationally, but that we actually really try and allow for the diversity of possible definitions. Victoria talking about social, Pam asking questions about the other than human. There are so many different ways, so many different paradigms that can be used to define creativity. And rather than kind of trying to pin it down to one, really allowing for that plurality, I think that's a real message for the research community that's come out today. I think other messages of what we can do better, the notion of both access to the digital and also trying to work with, this is something that's come through on the mural, trying to work with the digital as a creative tool, not just the means to access a large group of people or to, you know, get into school virtually, but how do we use, I mean, we're trying here in a very simple way to use Mural to get over some of the facts that we can't be in the same room, but also not to see a sort of digital as a deficit. What are the advantages? What more can the digital offer us creatively? And that's certainly something that Bill was referring to in the second report of the Durham Commission. That being a really kind of key area. If we want to keep working with creativity, expand it as a notion, we need to get better at understanding the digital affordances alongside improving digital access. I think, again, another thing we can get better at is progression, understanding progression in creativity. What does it look like when a school first starts out doing creativity? What are the stepping stones? And that was a big message that came out of the expert seminar that where we prepared the provocation document as well. How can we better articulate to those not in the creative research and practice community what progression, getting better, doing more, getting deeper in creativity, what that looks like. And I think that's about a conversation between HE as people who have sort of skills in evaluation and research in schools to really help that happen. And another thing that's come through on the mural is that exactly that relationship. How can we get a better relationship between HE and school research, school practice, school evaluation, school assessment? I think that's particularly difficult in England at the moment. The UK government does not seem to have a huge amount of respect for the educational research community, and therefore there seem to be often barriers in the way of schools being able to have stronger relationships with education departments in higher education. But I think that is certainly something we could try and get better at and kind of push back against policymakers in relation to. There's a few other things Joe and Victoria have already touched on, but I think there's a couple of things to just pick up from the provocation document which haven't come through so strongly today, which I think are important to sort of wave an additional flag for, I think. How we involve young people in the conversation about this, not just giving them agency in the classroom, but how do we give young people agency in how we develop schools, how we develop research agendas? So really trying to have them part of the conversation, part of conversations like today. How can we make that more proactively involving for children and young people was a big message that came out of the expert seminar. And then the very last one, which I think has been a slight ripple undercurrent of the conversations today, but which hasn't come through explicitly, is a notion of cultural diversity and how we think about practice and research creativity. I'm increasingly starting to be aware of overlaps between creativity research as a change maker and conversations that are going on in terms of decolonizing education, of racism and tackling racism in education, of gender issues in education, and how creativity, how we as a creativity community of researchers really hook into and work alongside and work to change issues around things like decolonization, gender rights, race rights, etc. I think was a core part of the conversation with the experts, and that hasn't filtered through so strongly today. So I think it's important to wave the flag for that particular element of possible future research and practice. I think that's all we've probably got time for. So quite a few things that we can get better at, but also I think really heartening that I think, and in fact, one last thing I did want to say was that I think we can get better at celebrating our successes. I think we in the UK and England especially have got to a point where we have a headset of, oh, we're on a sort of downward trajectory in terms of creativity following, 10 years, 2010, the axing of CP, all of those things that happened. And for us as a community, we kind of shrank and things felt a little kind of inward looking. we could get better now, I think, as Bill was saying, at sort of recognising there's real potential on the horizon for creativity research and practice too. So I'll try and end it on a more positive note than what we can, that's a better thing that we can get better at, is celebrating our successes as a creativity research community. So I'm going to wrap up this first part of today now. We're due to take a half an hour break until 3:30. So please take a comfort break, make yourself a cup of tea, but do come back and, as Victoria said, contribute, keep pitching into the mural, keep posting questions, answer other people's questions if you've got an answer you want to put in the mix. Joe, I can see there's one other thing you want to add. Go ahead.
I wanted to remind people also that of the BERA conference and the opportunity of that as an occasion to continue these conversations. You know, it's an environment in which we can also look at where it is that practice and research agenda can continue with our support.
Yes, and that's an online, for those of you not aware, that's an online conference this year. So you don't even have to leave the comfort of your own homes still. You can do that from your living room. So great. So we're going to close this part of the event. And then at 3:30, we're really delighted to have Professor Howard Gardner from Harvard offering the Anna Craft Memorial Lecture. So we'll see you back here at 3:30, ready for the memorial lecture. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to this BERA Creativity SIG afternoon event. I want to start by saying another big thank you to Sarah, Teresa and Bill for their contributions to the earlier part of the session today. I think everybody got a huge amount from it. And now we're going to move on, as I think we normally do now at this event, to the Anna Craft Memorial Lecture. I think this is our 5th lecture. And I just wanted to also kind of welcome Teresa Kremen, who I organise these lectures with every time they happen. So Teresa is there in the background too. This lecture should have happened last year, but for all the obvious reasons, we were due to host this event physically at University of Exeter, but clearly we weren't able to do that. So the whole event was postponed until now. So I'm really glad to be here with Howard Gardner, who's offering the lecture this year. As I said, it was due to happen at Exeter. We take it in turns between the Open University and Exeter to host the event. So last year, Professor David Hall, who was our head of school at the time, was due to introduce Howard. Dave has since stepped down from that role, but I thought it only right and proper that Dave should continue with the invitation to introduce Howard on behalf of Exeter, having had the event postponed. So I'm just going to hand over to Professor David Hall now on behalf of Exeter University to introduce Howard. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Kerry, and it's wonderful that the lecture is able to go ahead this year. It's my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker for the 2021 Anna Craft Memorial Lecture, Professor Howard Gardner from the University of Harvard. Before doing so, however, I just wanted to say how important this event is for many of my colleagues here at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Exeter. Anna was a very much loved and valued colleague at Exeter, and a number of those present here today worked closely with Anna during her time with us in GSE. So today is a really special moment, and this is a sentiment that I know shared by her former colleagues at the Open University. I'm also conscious that Anna's family, including her mum and dad, Alma and Morris, her husband Simon, her children Hugo and Ella, are regular attendees at this memorial lecture. So I'd like to extend an especially warm welcome to them. Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Research Professor and Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's the recipient, as many of you will know, of a huge range of awards and honours for his remarkable contribution to academic theory and public policy. Of course, many of us know Howard's work through his seminal critique of what are now widely understood as simplistic and dangerously reductive notions of human intelligence. Although I think it's perhaps fair to say that the reach of this understanding remains a little more restricted than many of us would like. Others of us, perhaps especially members of the BERA Creativity and Education SIG, will be more conscious of Howard's contributions on learning, thinking, ethics, and creativity. But putting all of this work together with Howard's close academic collaboration with Anna, it's really hard to think of a more apt choice of speaker. So it's at this stage that I ask you all to view Howard's pre-recorded lecture online before you have the opportunity to join in a post-lecture question and answer session at 4 o'clock. So over to you, Howard, for your pre-recorded lecture.
Greetings, I'm Howard Gardner, speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm very grateful and honored to have the chance to give this talk in memory of Anna Kraft. I had the privilege of knowing Anna for well over a decade. It was a wonderful, life-enhancing experience. We met in 2002 at a conference in Harrogate. The conference had a simple title, Thinking. And that was appropriate for Anna. She was always thinking, listening, probing, creating, reflecting, progressing in her understanding, sharing it with others. It's fair to say that we hit it off, finding many mutual interests, increasingly many mutual concerns. And it proved possible, it was perhaps easier then, to arrange for Anna to be a visiting scholar at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I teach, and at Project Zero, with which I've been associated by my whole scholarly life. For 4 years, Anna commuted between England, London or Exeter, and Cambridge, Mass. She became, in fact, a member of our small and devoted research team as we were focusing on intelligence, creativity, and increasingly on good work, striving to do the right thing in challenging circumstances. Our families got to know one another, and indeed, one summer, I think it was in 2003, Anna and her young family stayed in our home on Larchwood Drive near Fresh Pond in Cambridge. They even took care of Nero, our golden retriever. Over the next decade, we remained in close touch, meeting in the US, in the UK, and no doubt in other places. We met at other conferences on thinking, and at other conferences which did not have that lofty a name or aspiration, but where Anna was, as always, thinking and sharing. And indeed, with Guy Claxton, we edited a book called Creativity, Wisdom, Trusteeship, 3 fears which Anna probed and in many cases exemplified. We complemented one another. I think Anna was more philosophically oriented. She'd studied philosophy and kept up with readings and writings in that discipline. She was also more practitioner-oriented than I am. She taught in schools and in the Open University. I would like to believe I helped her to formulate and articulate ideas in ways that could speak to both scholars and to the general public. And our areas of disagreement, or at least differences in emphases, proved catalytic, at least for me. In 2013, Anna was kind enough to come to Boston to the celebration of my 70th birthday and to contribute a wonderful essay to my Festschrift. At that time, we did not know that she was ill. At least I did not know, nor how little time she had left. Her death was a tragedy. Her life was an inspiration. I could easily speak at length about our work together, but I've encouraged to talk about the ideas that Anna and I discussed in her last years, and to bring that work up to date, so to speak. And that's the reason for my topic today, enabling good work in the 20th century. Think of it as a progress report that I would have liked to share with Anna. The story I want to tell begins in the middle 1990s. 3 middle-aged psychologists, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Bill Damon, and I, were fortunate enough to spend a year at a retreat on the Stanford University campus, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. We knew we wanted to work together on a project. We had applied to the center as a trio, but we needed time, space, and freedom to reflect and to define a project. Our initial interest, whether individuals could be both creative a special interest of Mihai and Mai, and humane or moral at the same time. This was Bill's area of expertise. And over the course of the year, we developed an empirical research project which we named, perhaps predictably, Humane Creativity. Neither the name nor the project itself had been adequately formulated. In the ensuing period, the late 1990s, we went back to the drawing boards and to our word processor and decided to study what we soon came to term good work. In a nutshell, we were interested in how individuals in different professions thought about their work, and especially about the kind of work and the kinds of workers that they most admired. To find an answer, we and our research team, ultimately a few dozen researchers on 5 campuses, carried out semi-structured interviews, often lasting an hour or more, with approximately 1,500 individuals in 9 different professions or lines of work. From several perspectives, the project was quite successful. We learned a great deal about a range of professions. We wrote a summary book, as well as 9 other books and numerous articles and reports. The work attracted some attention both in the United States and abroad. And, always important for scholars, it launched further lines of work that continue in several laboratories till this day. Good news, no need to read all those books. I believe it's possible to summarize the principal concepts and findings with reasonable succinctness. Good work has 3 intertwined properties. It's performed excellently, it's personally engaging, and it's carried out in an ethical manner. We think of these as a triple helix. On our analysis, work only qualifies as good work if it exemplifies these 3 E's. Otherwise, it's compromised in one or more ways. Drawing now on the research in our own good project work, I'd add the following points. Good work is analogous to good citizenship. A good citizen is well-informed, excellent, cares about civic issues, engaged, and strives to do what is best for the broader community, ethical. It's useful to distinguish between the work of a growing child and the work of an adult professional. In early life, one should strive for neighborly morality, living up to long-lasting and widely embraced standards like the Golden Rule and the 10 Commandments. The requirements for neighborly morality aren't difficult to state, and few would quarrel with them, though they may be challenging to fulfill. In contrast, the adult professional is frequently, even constantly, confronted with difficult ethical decisions. These are conundra that could not have been anticipated in biblical times. They presuppose complex occupations. They call for nuanced, profession-specific codes of conduct, the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, the Journalistic Code of Conduct, and the like. The ethics of roles also envelops the role of citizen, as mentioned above. In confronting difficult dilemmas at work or in citizenship, it's advantageous to have a method for considering options. We speak informally of the 5 Ds: definition, discussion, debate, decision, debriefing. Expanding a bit, if one wants to uphold ethical standards, one must recognize the existence of an ethical dilemma. Then one defines the issues and discusses and debates them. Ultimately, it's necessary to reach a decision about that dilemma. And of course, one seeks to make the decision, propose an action that's effective and that can be ethically justified to others, including those who may not have agreed with the decision. But one is not always on the mark. And so sometimes after the decision has been made and effected, one looks back, debriefs, and determines whether one can or should have followed a different course. We posit a developmental course for the ambit of good work. Envision a set of concentric circles. At first, in the tightest one, one's concerned with one's own family. Then in succession with neighbors, schoolmates, colleagues at one's first job. And many of us stop there. But others assume successively expanding rings of responsibility, which includes one's profession as a whole, and in the broadest case, responsibility to the wider society, which we call trusteeship. There's no imperative to go beyond one's own work circle. But for those individuals who do become leaders or even trustees, they have to be concerned with the quality of work they do, and so do we as the recipients of that work. And we have to be aware, in the less happy case, that the decisions they make and carry out can be destructive. They can have very wide pejorative ramifications. We can see such ramifications with clarity when one contemplates the world experience with COVID-19. Individuals with influence, physicians, lawmakers, business leaders, are constantly faced with dilemmas. And while their decisions and actions may sometimes affect only a few persons, they may and often have impacted a much broader swath of society. Until now, I presented ideas which my colleagues and I developed primarily as scholars, researchers, conceptualizers. And indeed, that was the training, the calling that my colleagues, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, Bill Damon, and I had in the first part of our careers. But each of us, as well as some of our colleagues and collaborators, elected to go beyond the usual confines of scholarship. And so, in the last 15 years, my colleagues and I at Project Zero have moved closer to the world of action, of practice, and accordingly, we now operate under a broader umbrella, which we call simply the Good Project. In this vein, we've carried out several distinctive activities. We've made available materials that emerged from our initial study of good work. Specifically on our website, users can access simple sample work dilemmas, the so-called Good Work Toolkit, and what's our most popular item, the value sort. Also available are materials from other good work endeavors, such as the Good Play Project, which was about the constructive use of digital media, and the Good Collaboration Toolkit, how individuals and entire organizations can work together effectively. We've also created a good work curriculum. This consists of a dozen lessons that can be used and adapted at various age levels and for various purposes and constituencies. Recently, we've begun to work with college students. We asked them to create ethical portfolios where they can report their own dilemmas and how they deal with them. Ultimately, we would like to create ethically oriented course materials for the college or university level. We have formed collaborations with individual and groups in several countries around the world. Notably, among these collaborations are our work with the Dutch Professional Pride Association, the India TGELF, the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and the Singapore Institute of Management. And we're developing curriculum for educators who work with Global Citizens Initiative, GCI, a program for talented secondary school students from around the world. To keep track of our activities and to maintain contact with current and future collaborators as mentioned, we have an active website, thegoodproject.org. This website includes well over 100 papers we have written, as well as regular blogs, now over 50 contributions. We also have a newsletter that comes out several times a year, and of course all of this is available on request. The Good Project continues, even as the world also changes, often rapidly, sometimes quite dramatically, not often in ways we would like. While most work in the natural sciences is not materially affected by political and economic events, such happenings are crucial, sometimes pivotal, in the world of human affairs. Since the Good Work Project was initiated 25 years ago, there have been numerous powerful forces and trends in the world. The world has grown ever more interconnected. Like it or loathe it, globalization is now an inexorable fact of life. And of course, the pandemic has brought that fact home to nearly everybody. The bilateral world, communism versus democracy, has now evolved into a multipolar world. At the same time, nationalism and autocracy have renewed appeal and have attained power in many parts of the world. I'm resisting the temptation to show slides here because the list of autocrats and autocratic nations is depressingly long. The accessibility and the virality of social media competes with, when it has not already overwhelmed, traditional forms of news and communication. And alas, fake news proves more viral than well-curated journalism. Neoliberal assumptions and guidelines undergird political, economic, and educational systems and processes in many parts of the world, even as they have been subjected to ever deeper and fundamental criticisms, and this was a particular concern of Anna Kraft's in the last years of her life. Both the learned professions and the major institutions of our society have been severely disrupted. This is due to some extent to their own smugness and all too frequent self-dealing. But the decline of the professions is also due to the aforementioned powerful forces. Some even wonder whether professions and institutions will survive. Others wonder whether they deserve to survive. We've come a long way since that bucolic year at the Stanford Center for Advanced Study, or indeed my first meeting with Anna at Harrogate early in this century. Many of our core assumptions have been severely challenged. We must search for dry land. In large part, this is a challenge for education. Educators, policymakers at all levels need to value the nature and preservation of good work. We need examples, powerful examples, existence proofs, embodiments of professions and professionals and institutions that have worked well, that continue to work well, or that can be fixed so that they work well again. Equally, we need institutions, businesses, governmental agencies, and non-governmental agencies that function effectively and in good work ways. Universities, libraries, museums, think tanks, and the like. What has been termed civil society, though it's sometimes difficult to discern its civility. Moreover, we need sanctions, powerful sanctions, for individuals, professions, and institutions that fail to do good work, as well as prosthetics to help those that want to do better as they go forward. The case for warranted knowledge, the search for truth, is fundamental. Over the long run, good work is not possible in a world of fake news or alternative realities. I close on a very personal note, admittedly a grand one. I'm not myself religious, but I don't see how the planet can be restored without a set of beliefs and practices to celebrate the best features of our species, individually, regionally, globally. In my mind, there's little question that human beings can tackle and solve the challenges of our time. But this can only be done if we're willing to face the threats to the species, which now extend to the very survival of the species. Thinking and research of the sort that our research group has done, and that Anna Kraft carried out with such skill and vigor, will be essential. But in my personal view, it's far from sufficient. Such scholarly work will also require linkage with beliefs and practices, the texts and the rituals that have animated the major religions of the world. Too often, these religions have struggled with and against one another. A truly global belief and action system needs to relinquish the struggle and find common ground. What was once God's work needs to become good work. Thank you for your kind attention. It's been an honor to remember and to celebrate the contributions of Anna Kraft.
Thank you so much, Howard. As you said in the lecture there, I think Anna would have been delighted to hear that progress report following on from the conversations, the rich conversations that you had so many times with her in that relationship over the years. I think, you know, you talked about Anna's life being an inspiration, and I completely agree with that, and I still see that in the work that our students at Exeter produce. We give them her ideas and they fly, and it's always a delight that Anna's work still has the impact that it does, and to hear how the work that you engage with her in, particularly that book with Anna and Guy Claxton, how the foundations of that have grown into the Good Work Project and all those other initiatives as well. It's brilliant. I did also want to say a particular thank you to you from Alma, Anna's mum. It was Alma that suggested to us that you would make a great next memorial lecture speaker. So I'm sure Alma especially is particularly pleased to have heard you speak today. Teresa, I don't know if you wanted to say anything before we open up to questions. Just to say to colleagues, you can use the same Slido that we used for the previous part of the event to start to pose questions to Howard. I'm sure he's very ready, having not had to actually deliver the lecture, to answer those questions. But before we shift to those questions, Teresa, would you like to say anything in response to Howard?
Classic, isn't it? There, I'm liking to thank you, and I couldn't thank you because I was on mute. Apologies. Such is life in these challenging times. Now, I just want to thank you too. Like at Exeter, our students and particularly our PhD students engage with Anna's work, particularly around possibility thinking and the challenges of tomorrow, that sense of wise humanizing creativity, how we go forward wisely, sagely with good work, and replacing our own our value systems and integrity. And that was key to what you were sharing there. I wanted just the whole notion of excellence and engagement, and just really wanted to ask a question around when you see when you are making the argument around good work about adults' engagement, what are the kind of parallels for the engagement of the young? Engagement is a word that's used very much in Britain when children are kind of taking part in education. They're engaged in education. I'd just be interested in your reflection on engagement for children in a parallel way to engagement for the adults there.
Okay, that's a good question, which I've thought about more with regard to adult workers than with regard to children. My first thought is that any child who is raised in any kind of a non-hyper stressful situation has no trouble getting engaged in things that he or she is interested in. I mean, all over the world, it's harder to stop kids from playing than it is to keep them, than it is to make them play. But I think the problem in much of our society is that what kids get engaged in may not be the things that we would like them to be engaged in. I mean, let's just take social media. I don't think there are any parents that I know of who wish their kids would spend more time on social media. And in our recent study of college that I mentioned, we found that American college students use the word I or me 11 times as often as we or us. And that emphasis goes very much against good work. So I guess what I would say in response to your question is, as educators, it's our job to find things that kids are interested in, or things that we can get kids interested in them, but then to provide opportunities, but also guidance to do so in a way that's constructive and maybe even goes beyond those narrow rings of responsibility. I think where many of us fail is not because of lack of good intention, but rather because we don't really understand the tremendous lure of things which are either quite destructive, say gambling, or things which can be a big waste of time, like social media, or games like Minecraft, which my grandchildren are consumed with, which can sometimes be cognitively stimulating, but there's a whole world out there beyond those blocks and those scenes.
So that's how I think about that question. In our work with adults, we found that it's very difficult for most people who are working in, let's say, schools, to be engaged unless there's support for them. And this can come from colleagues, or less frequently, though, connecting to my lecture, from religion. But if you have neither colleagues who share your sense of mission and make you want to come to school rather than to look forward to Friday and your paycheck, metaphorically speaking, then you need to have a very deep belief in what you're doing. And in my particular case, it wouldn't involve in religion, but anybody who studies the world knows that religion and religion's type missions are great motivators, and they can be very positive motivators. They can also be destructive ones, of course. So I'm rambling, which is usually what you do when you don't have a succinct answer to your question.
It's interesting, the whole notion of, having colleagues that are close to your mission. I literally earlier today was at a meeting with some English leads, and they were saying how much they valued each other because we all care about the same things, which is that kind of sense of having colleagues who are close to your mission, and colleagues who are attending today care deeply about creativity and wanting to create through research and through practice, a richer future for the young in that regard. But I'm going to hand back to Kerry. I expect there's some questions in Slido. Can you see?
Indeed, yes. The questions are coming in, and the first question I'm going to ask you from the Q&A wall, Howard, is from Sandra Wolf. And Sandra is asking, are neoliberal tendencies on the wane, or are they progressing? And she also would like to know, how do educators resist neoliberal tendencies? Please.
So the word was neoliberal that was being asked.
Yeah.
Well, we live in the two countries which are the central loci for neoliberalism. And I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about the United States under Joe Biden than I am on the UK under Boris Johnson. On the other hand, when it comes to populations as a whole, I'm probably somewhat more optimistic about the UK than I am about the US. But you're not really interested in my political crystal ball. I think that if we look at it historically, the ideas for neoliberalism got their start in the post-war era, and they really grew quite dramatically in the Reagan-Thatcher era, though they certainly weren't restricted to those. I mean, one can make a case that Bill Clinton and Tony Blair were carrying on the neoliberal tradition. My succinct answer is you cannot confront a powerful set of ideas unless you have a contrasting powerful set of ideas. And many of us hope that the pandemic and climate change and the huge asymmetries of wealth and health in the world will generate some kind of a counter force. I've often said that I think Gandhi is the most important person of the last 1,000 years because he was a religious figure without flaunting religion. But all I can do is to try to encourage in my own work those alternative stances to neoliberalism. And I wouldn't pretend to do an examination of the educational systems in the US or the UK. But I just finished reading a book by Pasi Sahlberg, whom many of you will know, and with an introduction by Andy Hargraves, who many of you will know. And the book has a title called To Trust Teachers. This is an idea which is unknown to the leaders of educational establishments in our two countries. But if you look at countries which are successful in K-12 education, it's countries where the teachers are trusted and respected. And in the college study that we've completed for the previous question, again, I didn't start out with any kind of enthusiasm about schools which were religious in the United States. But in fact, religious schools, and we could talk about what that means in the United States, have a sense of mission which affects the students. And Harvard, where I've been forever, long since gave up its Puritan and its Protestant tradition. And I wouldn't have been there as a Jew if they hadn't done that. On the other hand, there is no mission to the school. Even the word truth is something that people know, veritas, but they don't identify with it. So again, I'm wandering a bit, but those comments they obtain both to K-12 and to college. If we want people to be engaged by the right thing, we have to give them powerful ideas and support them.
Great, thank you so much, Howard. And I think that notion of the enormity of neoliberalism and how we have to sort of push back against that with something just as powerful is a really important one. And perhaps joining the dots between some of the ideas that are around to make that effort work, I think is one way to think about that. Teresa, would you like to take the next question for?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's lots of very interesting questions coming in. I want to ask them all, but I've only got one choice. So I'm going for one by Sarah Campbell, who's thanking you, Howard, as many people are indeed, for your film, for your lecture. And her question is around what you consider the shared characteristics of living and learning ethically and then living and learning creatively are. So putting along that ethical and creative dimension.
Okay, well, I'm glad to have that question in part because I know that's the theme of the meeting of the BERA this year of this group. I think that I think of those issues rather differently. I think that when I think of equity, I think of what are the provisions and what are the supports that you give in any community so that people feel that they belong rather than, to use a cliche, that they've gotten the short end of the stick. And as a white male, it was very easy for me to think that things were equitable if I got my own share, but certainly the scales have fallen from my eyes in the last decades as I see how many individuals don't feel that they have a fair chance. The link to creativity is interesting because I think for a minority of people, being rejected, feeling that things are not equitable can be a stimulus. I'm going to show you that I can do it better and differently. And we could each think of dozens of people who end up making major contributions of a creative sort, who certainly were feeling reactive rather than supportive by their environments. But I don't think that we should try to craft an educational system so that the individuals have to be creative. I think we need an educational system where there's an opportunity to be creative. And here's where my new interest in higher education becomes very relevant. In many ways, China, or I would even say Singapore, though it's not the same case as China, are doing a much better job of educating the bulk of their citizens than more neoliberal societies. But there's not the free play of the mind in those societies. And Hong Kong is, of course, it's now the poster child, because we used to look to Hong Kong as a place where in ideas and art, in business and finance, individuals could be creative, but now they're ending up in jail. So there's the tension there. And I think that a good question for the final exam for our students is, how to essentially balance a society of opportunity and equity with a society which promotes rather than thwarts creativity.
Thank you. I mean, it's that whole notion we were discussing before, definitions of creativity in the first half of the session, and that whole notion of the free play of the mind and giving children the chance to, or fostering their capacity to go imagine, go play, go explore, as it were, seems to be critical to moving forward, really, whatever age they are, regardless of whether they're, you know, higher ed or teaching, or indeed 5-year-olds. They seize it. And as you said earlier, perhaps that notion of getting engaged is when you really free flow your way in, you know, as it were, you find your way into what you are engaged in, and then can engage in some kind of serious play or deep play in that space. Kerry, do you want to pick up? Well, go on.
Just one thing that, you know, I've done a lot of work on creativity, and some of it, you know, was, you know, in tandem with Anna, but you know, in the recent work I've done with Emily Weinstein, it's become clear to me that the whole stance that I took in creativity needs to be rethought because of what's possible with computers, with AI, with social media, and so on. And I think there's going to be much less of the individual genius in his or her garret, and much more of people working together, often using mass communication and data collection techniques and so on. And I think here, our students will probably be educating at least my generation, and maybe generations of other people who are listening and watching. That's fine. No reason why creativity needs to be done in 2021 the way it was done in 1921.
You haven't, President.
Sorry, I've just unmuted myself. Thank you, Howard. I'm just going to move us on to the next question now. This comes from Professor Justin Dillon, a colleague here at University of Exeter. Bearing in mind, one of the things we were talking about in the earlier session was Bill Lucas was talking to us about the fact that creativity will be on the PISA tests in 2022. And Justin would like to ask you, Howard, to what extent are international assessments such as PISA a threat or an opportunity for children and schools?
I guess the answer is yes. It all depends on the test. What occurs to me immediately is that if you give students some freedom in responding to a prompt, then the question is, how does the prompt get evaluated and by whom? And I'm sure there are some AI, some artificial intelligence ways in which we can do a kind of a first pass assessment of how creative a response is. But also, you know, referring to, as I did to China before, I'm quite sure if China wants to figure out how to get kids have high creative scores, it will succeed, because there's no secret on what algorithms I use to find them. I am not a critic of PISA or of TIMSS and other OEC items. I think they do the best they can, but you know, it's a political organization in a neoliberal era, and I don't hear anybody saying, well, we've been doing too much testing, let's stop doing it. But this is a challenge for creative test makers. You know, I mean, let's take multiple intelligences, and I'm very glad nobody has brought that up yet. I mean, the first impulse when people heard about multiple intelligences, when they were psychometrically oriented, was let's create 7 tests. And I said, I think the tests are the problem. On the other hand, you can create environments where you can observe people playing and watch what they're interested in. This gets back to engagement. And you know, if you see those people returning to those environments but doing new things, that would be a measure of intelligence and creativity. But it's not the sort of thing which the Educational Testing Service in the United States or OECD is likely to push for. But if they do, great.
Thanks, Howard. I think it relates to a discussion we were having slightly earlier about you sort of saying they're doing the best job they can. Bill Lucas was talking to us about some of his work with PISA and trying to create an assessment that focused on written and visual, means, and it being a struggle to even get the visual into that process. So I think, yes, your answer of yes is kind of an expansion is helpful there. Thank you. Okay, Teresa, would you like to select the next question?
Thank you. Well, I'm looking at one that Charlotte's asked. She says, Howard, that creativity is often described as a survival skill, yet schools can be resistant to creative practices. And so she's kind of putting the tension that particularly English schools, I think, are currently engaged in relation to, wanting to nurture student creativity, but recognizing that it's challenging in these kind of current context, as it were.
Yeah, I think that seems to me to be a comment which makes sense to me. But one thing I worked on years ago, actually with Robert Sternberg, who many of you will know, was trying to figure out how to introduce some aspects of creativity into ordinary schools in the United States. And one of the ideas we had, I don't know to what extent people picked up on, was to take assignments which are done universally in the United States, so-called book reports. Where you read a book and you write about it. Now I would call it a synthesizing exercise, because that's what I'm interested in now. But you can get students to evaluate themselves and one another on, sort of how competent the book report is, but to what extent it actually opens your eyes, either the book itself or how you wrote about it. And we all read book reviews. That's part of what we do in our profession. And sometimes we read them because we have to. Sometimes we read because we learn them. Sometimes we say, gee, this really gave me a new idea. And I don't even know what it was the author of the book or the author of the book reviewer. So the simple, but I think non-trivial idea is don't say, let's burn up the book reports or the school projects, but rather let's use things which we're doing anyway, but to encourage the creative muscle rather than, let's say, the disciplined muscle or the regurgitating muscle. And I think what everybody who's listening to this knows is it's much easier for teachers to do it if they have that muscle themselves. If you have somebody who's been excellent in dutifulness, but has never taken any risks of any sort, it doesn't much help to say, well, from now on, be one of Liam Hudson's imaginative kids. It has no meaning to it.
I think that's so interesting. You weren't with us earlier, but we were talking about teacher creativity and risk-taking in the very first session, and how salient that is in terms of teachers just feeling that they have practiced the art of risk-taking, if it is indeed not, and have exercised their own creative muscles in order to support the exercise of others. And I do think that's teaching who you are, teaching the understandings you have is really an important kind of next strand of it all. I mean, do you think, is your sense within the research field that people are, in your own context, researching teacher risk-taking, teacher creativity, teacher, an understanding of their own identity as a creative artist or practitioner?
What comes to mind is less individual teachers and more milieus, educational environments where taking a chance, taking a risk, being prepared to fail or fail wisely or make new mistakes, not old ones, creating those kinds of environments. And, in some what we call private schools, what you call public schools, and in some what we call charter schools, and you have a similar term as well. When you create an environment like that, then you are more likely to engender those kinds of behaviors. But as I said earlier, if you don't have support from your colleagues, it's very difficult to do. And we all know, this is where we were a half an hour ago, that the neoliberal forces very much against that. I mean, if you want to be number one in PISA, that's what the reward is, and not number one in doing good work. We don't have. We don't have a test for that. And we know, I think, OECD does talk about global awareness. It's better if they don't. But when you have to appeal to all the countries in the world, the cricket match becomes very narrow. You can't really extend very widely, because then China won't use it, or Singapore won't use it, or Brazil won't use it, or the United States won't use it. One thing which people won't know unless you read the American press is that there are now efforts in many states to eliminate what's called critical race theory. That is, having people understand that the United States wasn't as wonderful as we've been taught, 100 years ago. And most states are going to put in legislation like that. And this is true in just about every country. I don't know what's happening in Britain on that topic. I hope that this doesn't come back across the Atlantic and to haunt you as well. I do have a question. I do have a question for you, for both of you. I get The Economist, right? And The Economist always has an obituary at the end. And the one that just arrived had an obituary of Edward de Bono. And both my wife, who's much wiser than I am, and I read it and said, boy, is this snarky. Snarky means this is rude and making fun of Edward de Bono. And since you all are in creativity, and Bono was I didn't know he died until I read the obituary. What's going on with this? Do you know?
Carrie, do you want to comment? I haven't read it,
Howard. I mean, I'm aware of a certain amount of the notion that Edward de Bono's work has been critiqued by some colleague as you might describe it as lightweight, not founded in evidence, perhaps. Although it's very popular, and certainly when I was first working with Anna, we used a lot of his work in our schools work as very accessible ways into some of the creative thinking when we were doing student voice projects and creative projects in all sorts of school settings. But my awareness is just that there have been critiques of his work as kind of, sort of lightweight rather than evidence-based. But Teresa, I don't know if you know any more.
No, to be fair, I honestly don't. But I haven't read the review. It is the case, though, isn't it? Pitiful in a sense, that somebody passes on, and then somehow or other, the media or whoever wrote the report, they're allowed a view. But really, to critique after the event seems to me to be not being honourable to the life that was lived. But there we are. That's a personal view.
I agree, and I think for all of us, one reason why Edward de Bono caught on is because he could speak to teachers. And many of us are not as good as that as he. I mean, his personality, I think, is irrelevant for his work. I was kind of, even for The Economist, I was kind of shocked. Anyway, I hope you will all read it. And if I'm wrong, send me an email. I'm easy to find.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I'll certainly go and read it. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So this question sort of changes the topic slightly. It's still within the realms of creativity, but it's about the sort of the big challenges. And it's from Oded Ben-Horin, a colleague in Norway. And Oded says, you mentioned the need to find ways of reaching over the boundaries of religion. What new practices can we implement in order to achieve this in the future?
Well, I have two very different thoughts. One is, if there was thought number one, if a missile was being shot at the globe and it looked like it was going to destroy the Earth, suddenly the differences between the United States, the UK, China, Russia would disappear. So, and we have threats like that, climate change being the biggest one, atomic energy, atomic weapons as much, but that's one kind of an answer to the question. But the other answer is from a man named Eric Liu, L-I-U, American of Chinese extraction, who I think is doing incredibly important things in the United States. He's devised something called Saturday sermons, where all over the country, people get together, and he really strives to make it across the political spectrum. He's got something called the Civic Collaboratory, which is people from all political strands, and that's quite, and he has people talking about things very much in a religious vein, but not particularly about God, though God's fine. As I say, we should do good work, let God take care of himself or herself. And I think the important note is rituals that take people out of their usual space and get them to think about big issues and about we kinds of issues, and as opposed to I issues. And to the extent I have energy left, that's all of my work now in colleges is trying to push in that direction. But I think a combination of threats and rituals would be my way of interreligion. And as I say, if you want to invoke Abrahamic God or Muhammad or Confucius or Buddha, great. Just don't punish me if I don't invoke those godlike figures.
I think following on from that, Howard, there's another question by Sue Dimmock, which is not quite the same, it's got some kind of connections. She's interested in the idea that you're moving away from that kind of lone creator in the garret towards a more collaborative creative processes, recognition of that, of the I to the we, as it were. And her question at the end of that kind of comment is, did lone creators really ever exist? And I think that's an interesting one. You know, was it that we were looking through a particular lens that didn't enable us to recognize those who were around them, supporting them and enabling them?
That's a great question. If you give me another hour, I will just talk about it because it's wonderful. I think the short answer is, of course, no. Nobody was ever in isolation. But I've just written a blog which will be posted soon, and the questioner can write to me, where I begin with a statement by Isaac Newton, which you all know. He said, if I could see farther, because I stood on the shoulder of giants, and a statement by Ludwig Wittgenstein, where he said, the major thing is to get rid of other people, not having to deal with them. And I think highly creative people need a lot of time by themselves, and they're speaking to 100 years from now. And the rest of us can't really get into that space. But of course, when they were young, Wittgenstein and Newton read everything, and they talked to everybody. But as they began to enter their own world, yes, they were lonely. And I just reread Anthony Storr's book, Solitude, and that's what prompted me to write this blog. So the answer is, of course, nobody worked alone, but you're very naive if you think that it's just all getting together and playing pinochle. It doesn't work like that. The most creative people have to spend a huge amount of time alone because they're in their own mind. They're not, and it's that their mind is well stocked. So it's a great question, but it's a very complicated one.
Thank you. That's just interesting. Kerry, over to you. Do we have time for one more? Maybe?
Yes, I think we can squeeze in one more. So possibly our last question comes from Pam Bernard at University of Cambridge. And Pam says, Howard, you constructed multiple intelligences. What about multiple creativities?
Okay. I don't know how much people know about the work that I did, but after writing about both intelligences, I decided to study, at the time, 7 people, each of whom was, by hypothesis, outstanding in one intelligence. I called it Creating Minds, and there was a linguistic person, a spatial person, and so on. What I actually found was that most of the people I studied, and these were people who were working for the centuries, is they had more than one area of intelligence, but that they also were, except for Igor Stravinsky, the composer, they were weak in one area. So they had jagged profiles, so to speak. But I don't think that this question really was asking me about the work that I did, as much as saying, are there different kinds of creativity? And there, the work that I've done with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I think is relevant. And I actually sent, the organizers a paper where we wrote about the 4 C's of creativity: big C, middle C, little c, and mini C. And big C is the Einsteins and the Freuds and the Martha Grahams of the world. And middle C is probably most of us who are trying to do the best we can in our academic work, but we're not going to be in the encyclopedia. Little C is planning a dinner party which you really want to go well, or a trip that you've never done before. My wife and I are watching the same serial probably watched called Us, about a couple in England that's getting divorced and the trips that they're taking. But we, in a paper, Emily and I posited a new kind of creativity called mini creativity, MINI, which is what tweets are. I don't tweet and I don't even know how, but it's being able to say something clever enough to go viral in very few number of characters. So those are multiple creativities. Obviously, if we had more time, the question I could think about creativity, not in terms just of how big it is or how little it is or in which field, but ones that are more synthesizing, ones that are more daring, ones that are more disciplined and so on. So it's a good parlor game, but it's not one that I have played very much.
Great, thanks for that answer, Howard. I think we need to wrap it up there. We're nearly at the end of the question and answer session. I just want to say a huge thank you to you on behalf of the University of Exeter, the Open University, and Anna's family and friends who are with us. It's been fantastic to have you here, and just to sort of I hope we made Alma's day, I shall say again, because I know, as I said at the beginning, she was very keen that you should offer the lecture this year. I would also say, Howard, please do have a look at the Slido, because there's not only are there questions, but there's lots of people thanking you in lovely ways for the lecture. So do take a minute to have a look at the Slido before you log off. There's lots of thanks there as well. And just to say to colleagues that the recorded lecture will be available on both the University of Exeter and the Open University websites. Possibly not right now, but in a few days it will be available, hopefully in both places, and we will let you know. And please do share the lecture. We're always keen that these lectures kind of reach people who haven't been able to attend in Anna's memory. So so please do share that when it's available. Great. Teresa, did you want to add anything?
Just thank you very much, Howard. It's been fabulous to have you here and be in a conversation and be quizzed. Gracious, I wasn't expecting it to come that way.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Howard, and thank you, everybody. I think we now close the event. Thank you very much.